It's time. Okay, let's begin the special Nantucket Conservation Commission meeting for May 21st, 2014. A couple reminders. Please turn off your cell phones, and any extra conversations, please take out into the hall. We're making a recording of this meeting, and is anybody else going to make an audio or visual recording? Okay, Peter Brace is making a recording, and that's all, okay? And just a reminder to the audience, this is focused on one item, that's the town of Nantucket SPPF at 85 through 107 Baxter Road. And that, I guess there's a MassDOT for Goose Pond Lane as well. But both of these items have been closed. So we're not taking any testimony tonight. And if we need clarification, we will ask for it. Unless there's something glaring and we see your hand really waving out there or something. But yeah, this is for us to discuss conditions and et cetera, to come up with an order. Okay, with that, I guess we're ready to go, huh?
Yes, I do have a little bit of a cheat sheet on its way that I forgot.
Okay.
Just coming. So, I just wanted to point out to everyone, too, for people that council is here, if we need help or guidance, we can do so. Sorry, I'm going to get behind. So the purpose of today, again, like you said, Ernie, was to discuss the merits of the application as they relate to our interest in performance standards, just amongst yourselves, and then hopefully, I guess my hope administratively at the end is the board can come to some sort of consensus for instructions to draft an order of conditions for a positive or a negative, and then we'll prepare that, and then we'll discuss the draft at the next regular meeting, then again on next Wednesday. That's my hope, administratively. You guys can take us on. We still have essentially another 14 days to issue out an order, so we can have more special meetings, more things in there. I mean, there's no rush, but I think the important part tonight is to really take your time to go through and talk about the information that was presented as it relates to the performance standards. I mean, even if you go resource area by resource area and have those discussions, I think anything that we can do to help craft findings and have a thorough analysis of the project will go toward whichever kind of order we draft to see if the project meets the standards or does not. And then if the project meets the standards, obviously conditioning and things will come in. Or if waivers need to be granted and those waivers were requested and you feel satisfied to grant those, we can discuss that as well.
Okay. And Jen, did you, if I remember right, you wanted to be out of here at 6 tonight?
We need to leave at 6.
You need to leave
possibly
at 6.
6:15, but that's as far as
Okay,
I can
so,
go.
That's pretty much my constraint, too.
okay, so we need to be really
So this,
at least trying to get through as much as we can.
well, the discussion is really just amongst yourselves. So
Right.
we can certainly, if we want to start locally, we can.
Okay.
Well, we've
cheat
got-
sheet here.
We decided this is, coastal beach, coastal bank, land into the ocean. We've talked back and forth as to whether this qualifies as that. But we've definitely got local and national regs for coastal beach and coastal bank.
Right. We also, so our resource areas there that we've seen are coastal beach, coastal bank, land subject to coastal storm flow is included in here, amazingly enough.
We have a summary of the resource areas and the interests.
Yes, they're on their way. They were left on my desk. I do apologize for that, but they will be here shortly. It's not anything new. It's just literally copies of the rules and regulations, but we'll go through there. But we can start for sure.
And I think we could also include wildlife habitat.
Well, wildlife habitat is one of the interests.
That's an
Yeah,
interest,
yeah.
okay.
So if we want to start with like coastal beach, we can start with
Yep.
coastal beach
Now
locally.
let's start with beach.
Sure. So if it's helpful,
Got a copy of the regs right here.
yep, that's why we can go ahead. So the interests that we're really looking at for beach are flood control, erosion control, storm damage prevention, fisheries, shellfish, wildlife, recreation, and wetland scenic views. So with coastal beach, under our local regulations, we also include the performance standards 1 through 8 of land under the ocean. So we can backtrack, or we can continue on through coastal beach.
So it assumes the same performance standard says land under the ocean. It doesn't
Correct.
rename them. And most of what is land under the ocean is dredging, piers, aquaculture, and number 7 is probably the one that's important here.
Number 7, and then also number 8.
Yes.
Could you repeat those again, please?
Yeah. You want me to?
Since I don't have a quick peek.
Sure, so we're looking at land under the ocean, Ian, so in the local regulations,
Yeah.
that's section 201. And the two standards that we're getting ready to discuss are performance standard 7 and performance standard 8.
And they are,
Performance standard 7 is that no new bulkheads or coastal engineering structures shall be permitted to protect structures constructed or substantially improved after 878. Bulkheads may be rebuilt
Yeah.
only if the commission determines there is no environmentally better way to control an erosion problem, including in appropriate cases the moving of the threatened building. Other coastal engineering structures may be permitted only upon a clear showing that no other alternative exists to protect a structure built prior to 978, but not substantially improved from imminent danger, is number 7. And number 8 is water-dependent projects shall be designed and performed so as to cause no adverse effects on wildlife, erosion control, marine fisheries, shellfish beds, storm damage prevention, flood control, recreation, and aquatic vegetation.
thank you.
No problem.
So I think it was number 8 that tended to come up as sort of the concern in this, at least one of the concerns, since there's no bulkheads. Well, I take that back.
Coastal engineering
You got a
structure.
coastal engineering structure there.
Right. And the first thing is this definitely qualifies as a coastal engineering structure
Oh, yeah, I think
with
that's...
what that's, so, I mean, that would be like the first finding either way, would be that this project as proposed is considered a coastal engineering structure.
Yeah, a hard coastal engineering structure.
I don't think there's a doubt about that,
Yeah.
No.
So I'm just trying to think.
I mean, that's a good finding for you guys to memorialize
Right, right.
that
to me.
if the group feels that it is a coastal engineering structure, then
I think that's, yeah.
it's kind of
I think that's an easy one.
the first
Okay.
step. All right.
Moving.
So this is kind of the step we're going to have to take, is to kind of build that
Yeah.
what it is, and then when we look at the resource areas, and I don't want to jump ahead too far, but when we get to like coastal banks, especially under the state act, there's a big determination of whether it's a bank for a sediment source, a bank for storm damage prevention, or if we're looking at both. So those are things that when we make our findings, regardless of the order that's put together, those are findings that we have to make to complete our analysis of whether or not these resource areas are functioning which way, so we know which standards we're looking at.
And I think it's fair to say that the coastal bank, well, and we can get to that when we get to that, but that serves both functions, as a sediment source and as storm
Okay,
damage.
Clearly, I mean,
It's a major
it's a
coastal bank.
major coastal bank, and it's a major sediment source, as well as protecting structures.
When we get to
It's,
coastal
it's
banks.
not only a sediment source. The fact is that the replenishment that is being proposed doesn't mimic the sediment source.
Correct.
Let's get into that detail when we get to the bank.
So under coastal beaches and tidal flats, they also serve as a sediment source for dunes and intertidal areas. They dissipate wave energy. They're permeable, or they were permeable. Let's see what else. I'm trying to think of other things that it says here. That's pretty much the 2 or 3 things for coastal beaches. So, oh, you've got them now? Okay. As far as wildlife habitat,
habitat as
Yeah.
well.
Used by coastal birds for feeding and nesting.
Them seals haul out.
Mhm.
Not to mention recreation, scenic views.
We also say in our this characteristics of coastal beaches, which are critical to wetland scenic views, are natural erosion and deposition cycles, relief and elevation, sense of openness and solitude. Land within 100 feet of a coastal beach or tidal flat is considered to be important to the protection and maintenance of coastal beaches and tidal flats. I'm just reading it because I've got it right here, and we're reviewing our. So the following interests are flood control, erosion control, storm damage, fisheries, shellfish, wildlife, recreation, and wetland scenic views. Well, it's the same thing.
Oh, it's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. It's just what we're reading.
Yeah, it is read on paper.
Yeah, it's just copies of the.
And you can write on paper. So
You guys can write on stuff.
Well, and you've got 310 CMR first, and then our local wetland regs second.
But just the applicable resource areas.
Right. Do we need to define the differences between the two, or just? I mean, they're the same resource areas. The only difference I can think of is when coastal erosion structures are even considered on state versus local.
Yeah, so anytime that there's a difference, especially if it's a more restrictive difference, we'll have to cover that. Or if there's something like the state act with coastal bank where it distinguishes between different types of coastal banks, we'll need a finding in there that you guys recognize which type of coastal bank that it is, or that it's both. Just okay. Our local regulations, the coastal bank is a coastal bank. So when we get to those, we'll have to deal with those in turn there. Or if you look at like coastal beach,
Yeah, land under the ocean, they actually are a little bit broader than we are.
correct. So you also see like in coastal beach too is, they have when a coastal beach is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention, flood control, or protection of wildlife, those standards apply. And then they also have significant to marine fisheries or the protection of wildlife habitat. There are more that apply. So the way our local regulations do that, those are the same interests that we have. We just group them all together into one above our performance standards. They require you to essentially find that it is this and not this, or it's both, or either way. And then those specific things apply.
Well, and for both their coastal beach definition and ours, it can also be used as a sediment source. So I think that's something people don't always think about, in addition to habitat and recreational use. So that might be a question for everybody, is this beach one that's contributing sediment offshore and nearby?
Well, those would be helpful things to discuss and decide early before we start going on these standards.
Okay, well, what do you guys think?
Beach as sediment source? Is that
Sarah,
what
could
you're
you add a couple of dB?
DB?
Yes, just to bring your microphone a little closer.
Oh,
or-
okay. Decibels.
Thank you.
I could think of a million other.
I'm going to guess
Meetings
that's the first
for
time
DB.
she's ever heard that before.
No, I have
Sarah,
heard.
be louder.
Yeah, normally I'm too loud. So, what Jeff just handed us is basically both the 310 CMR from the Department of Environmental Protection, which are the state regulations, and then I have pulled up, and many of us do, our local regulations.
They're in there too. They're just in the back.
So they're also attached. So we're kind of trying to just figure out what order to do. Right now we're talking about land under the ocean, and I just don't know if it's better to do all the state findings first or do state local for each resource area? What's the least confusing?
Got it.
Well, I think the beach is the hardest one in many ways.
Yeah,
The
no, I think so
beaches.
too.
Well, there isn't a bio in it, but it's,
There is any what?
there isn't a little caveat in here for structures on the beach, so
Right.
it makes it harder.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
one of the questions that I actually had for Jeff, that for public infrastructures, there's no
Right,
saving.
right.
So if you have a structure on a beach, which we have, it's definitely on the beach, then the performance standard says that no new bulkheads or engineering structures can be permitted to protect structures constructed or substantially improved after 878. Bulkheads may be rebuilt, blah, blah, blah. Other coastal engineering structures may be permitted only upon a clear showing that no alternative exists to protect a structure built prior to 978 and not substantially improved. So the problem is, we've got empty lots, we've got structures prior.
Yeah, well, the structures are sort of irrelevant in this almost, well,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's the road, and it's permitted as protection for the road, so.
Well, then that opens up the whole argument. I think that, if I remember right, Dirk kind of brought up, was talking about the state regs protect buildings, were designed to protect buildings. And we've defined structures more broadly, mainly in an attempt to be restrictive. You know, to say, well, if a swimming pool is considered a structure, if it's going into a buffer zone or a resource area or other things, you know. And, you know, Dirk argues that to apply that in this case, I hope I'm not putting words in Dirk's mouth, but actually weakens the state law, which we should not be able to do. We can strengthen the state law, but not weaken. So,
Well, part of it's the imminent danger clause too, so we originally permitted this
as a temporary
fix
emergency
for the
structure.
road that's in imminent danger. According to the
Right.
coastal beach, though, it doesn't even qualify for that.
I do think it's interesting, Mr. Chairman, that you raised what you characterize as the intent of the regulations as something for us to be considering here. And so when we look at the coastal bank, I guess we'll be coming to that, but we've referenced now that there is an exclusion in there for public infrastructure in there, which is not under coastal beach. And I'm sort of curious as to what the intent of that exclusion would be under the bank, and if we might flesh that out a little bit as well. Because if we're going to be trying to look at the intent here, we want to be even-handed about it, I think.
Yeah, I don't know why it wasn't included.
Could you bring your mic a little closer, Mike?
I would bring it as close as I can, which is what I have it, unless I can
Stand
extend the
Thank
thing or come forward. Can you hear me now?
I can, thank you.
Can you hear me? I was just saying, Ian, that the discussion had sort of gone on to what the intent of the regulation was, and I thought it was worth just referencing and noting that. And I'm curious if anybody has a view at the table here on what the intent under Coastal Bank,
Beach.
Coastal Bank number 1, 205B1 is where the Coastal Bank has the exclusion for public infrastructure, and I'm just curious why that would be in there.
Thank you.
Any thoughts from my colleagues on that?
Did you have a thought on it?
I only just sort of twigged onto that when the chairman brought up the intent of the definition of structure, and so I'm just, it has to be there for a reason. We didn't take it out when we last revised the regs, and I don't remember when it was put in.
Well, I would say in this case, I mean, I think looking at it again and from the comments last week, even if it's considered that broad definition or the use of public infrastructure is the weakening of state law, is we still have to apply the more stringent restriction from state law. So that really, even if there's an exclusion locally, if there's not an exclusion under state law, we can't be less restrictive under our local regulation. And that may be something where our local regulation is in error, in which case we'd still be applying the more strict standard of state law as opposed to local regulation.
The more protective standard?
Right, the one that doesn't allow
Right.
coastal engineering structures for public infrastructure. And even if you do allow, even if we were just doing the Nantucket law, we would still have to make a finding that there's no alternative that exists and that there's no or minimus adverse impact. Even if we did find for an exclusion or waiver for public infrastructures, we'd still have to make both those findings. That
Under an exclusion or under a waiver?
and if we decided that this deserved a waiver, we'd have to establish that there are no adverse impacts nor any alternatives.
Or any reasonable alternative?
Here it just says alternative exists.
You're not reading the waiver language.
That's true. I'm reading the performance standards.
You're reading the exclusion language. So you do,
The
waiver
performance
standard would be
standards.
waiving that performance
Right.
standard if we voted it, yes.
Yes.
And that's where we talk about reasonable alternatives.
So we're back to the
That
state.
that also is locally only. If the state is still more, if the state regulation is still more restrictive, then we're bound to hold to that more restrictive standard.
And the waiver language for the state says any alternatives, right?
Could we say more protective rather than more restrictive?
Sure. There,
More
It's just one way.
the state
More
is, the
protective
state in this
than-
case is more protective. We do not have the ability to grant waivers. The state doesn't have that provision. Only locally do we have waivers to our performance standards. So we're bound to the performance standards under the state regulations.
Well, then is this easy? That it simply doesn't fit the performance standards and we can't grant it?
Well, that's the discussion you guys have had.
Well, the reasonable alternative is moving the road, and that's what we're trying to do. So we are actually trying to do the alternative.
Well, I guess to help foster the discussion a bit, we also need to look at, as part of the information submitted by the applicant and by interested parties, a lot of discussion of alternatives, and a lot of alternatives were looked at or presented as feasible or not feasible or workable or not workable. Those are things to take into consideration when you have that discussion. If you feel that the applicant has demonstrated that this is the best option at this point for the project, then they've met that criteria. If you feel that there are other alternatives, either from their analysis or by other information that's provided, that would essentially accomplish the same task that meets the performance standards as well, then that's part of that analysis too. And it's just not, I mean, we've heard a whole host of alternatives, and I know a lot of us have watched a lot of alternatives go in and out over time, and those are things to take into account for your discussion. And it's just not just as simple as the road location or the road relocation or the building location or the building relocation. Is there other?
And there's
Other-
all of our discussions on this. We did at one point have a vote of the board just if there were reasonable alternatives to the geotube structure, and determined that there were, and that's when they initially came back with that joint
Yeah.
hybrid jute/geotube that we approved, and then ended up approving this because of the lack of jute material initially during the summer, with kind of a lot of discussion about having that jute put in later, which didn't come up again in the discussion of this NOI.
now would be a great time for that, and if we wanted to look at if that would be a reasonable alternative to take out what's there and replace it with jute and quartz.
Four? Yeah.
Or jute slash, I mean, the what we had initially approved with that emergency order that we first approved was, what, 2 geotubes with 2 jute on top, so that you would have the balance of the more protection at the toe with the jute that was also, in a sense, acting the way that the bank would as far as sediment supply.
So do we think
At
that
least that's how I remember the
would
discussion.
potentially be a
Yep.
reasonable way to go from this point, would be to undo part of what's been done and replace it with the jute?
Well, that's certainly that's one option.
I think if that's a discussion to be had, not to interject, but I think when you go into making changes, I think a discussion of what the impacts would be of making that change would be appropriate too. For
That's up high enough that I don't think there'd be any
So-
more adverse impact.
That'd be a way of getting to a component of what's reasonable.
correct.
Well, yeah, and all we have to decide if we think there are reasonable alternatives.
You can't redesign the NOI
rather than
for
redesign
them.
the
Right,
project.
right.
And then the whole jute system is held up pretty good on Weimar's
Yep.
property, and I know we get into that argument about is the fact that, you know, the fiber bags shed sand and then the bank becomes a sediment source. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? You know, I guess depends on which side of the bank you're standing on.
Yeah, or to which interest?
Yeah, what's your interest?
Yeah, the sediment into the littoral cell, sort of right up against the storm damage prevention and erosion prevention.
Well, we've had at least 2 letters in the last year one from Dr. Young and one from Jim O'Connell that say the geotubes act more like a seawall than jute or core tubes do, that they have more of a permanence, which is why they're considered more protective at the toe of a bank. But, you know, I think that's a reasonable alternative, is to use something that mimics, that's a compromise between a geotube and just nourishment or just plantings. So I think it's fair to add, and we have evidence in front of us from, including the state of Florida now, considers those a coastal armory. And that's the November 5th letter. So, I mean, it wouldn't be just opinion. I think we have information that shows that the geotubes might stay in place longer, but they're definitely keeping sediment from coming out.
Yeah, and the engineers, the proponent engineers presented that was the minimum thing that they could be confident would work. And I know that the council for Quidnet drew a couple of engineering sketches for us here at the table that we have, but I don't know of any other engineers who offered an opinion otherwise, that said that something lesser would be successful. And so, I remember talking about it, looking through some of the notes the other day, and when we talked about sort of what's the idea here, and is it over-engineered or is it adequately engineered? And sort of, you got engineers, and you got geologists, and you got lawyers. And so, if it's over-engineered, is there an engineer? Do we have something from an engineer saying that? I know we have a lot of opinion from lawyers and from other folks, but I don't.
I wouldn't necessarily rate an engineer's opinion over a coastal geologist, though. I mean, because who would you go to for adverse impact? Because an engineer's job is to design something that stays in place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you wouldn't ask them about adverse impact.
No,
I
but you
mean,
would
I
ask
think-
them, would it stay in place?
Right.
And
when
so if
you're-
the geologist is saying, this would be better for the littoral cell to have more sand coming out of these things, and that runs right into the other interest. And I know that the public comment that we heard, and much of the concern at the commission, is focused on how much sand in the littoral cell,
Right.
almost to the exclusion of the other interest and the whole other functions of the bank as protection against storm damage and erosion control.
Well-
And so,
We did have 2 presentations where, and I think Bruno even said that when there is sand available at the toe of the bluff at the time of a storm, that actually can be very protective. So there is
yes,
some
so
evidence
that brings us all into the mitigation and all that, everything that we talked about how much mitigation. And the thing that strikes me about that is that when we did have Mr. McConnell in here for the Quidnet-Squam group, and on that day the other members of the Quidnet-Squam group were saying that they're not opposed to the project, and Mr. McConnell said, I'm asking for 3 things here. He spelled them out, and the applicants in the town said yes, yes, and fine, okay, we'll do those things.
I don't think they did.
So the amount of mitigation then increased to be quite a bit more than what is being put on in front of the core logs of there, to be about nearly double that. Would it go like from 12 to where are we at? Where is it now?
14 to 22.
It's
We're at
whatever
22.
we say it is, but it's being proposed at 22. And so,
But
to me, that circles back around to sort of what's the reasonable amount of mitigation, or what could one expect. So during that interval when the thing is functioning as a seawall, is that extra 10 yards per foot on average going to be what it takes? And if it isn't, do we want more?
Well, it's not just the volume, Mike.
Yeah.
It's the rate of release
And the time.
and over and how long it's releasing. And that's one of the issues with this, is that 22 cubic yards could go very quickly, and then it's out in the system, and there's, we've lost that sort of constant dribbling of material.
So you'd
in.
want to put sort of core in front of the geotubes or something like that?
Well, I think the core tubes help mimic that.
Or jute?
Right, right.
then
And we
the
have
other thing,
engineering that supports that, or is that opinion?
I think
I think that's
a
true.
lot of experience of hearing people come in that have had these things, and I just think, I know it wasn't part of this hearing, but thinking back to all the stuff Mark Ritz did back when they were permitting the geotubes.
Stuff from other hearings.
But we do
core
have,
tubes.
we have this from Jim Connell where he goes through each of the,
Yeah.
which is for this hearing. And he talks about exactly when and how sand is made available. I mean, there's, and it's a long letter, but basically he says timing is everything. They can put stuff in front, but once it's washed away, there's no more material in the beach or at the toe of the beach to be given up.
It's all out in the littoral cell.
But there's not, it actually dampens the wave energy. So the fact that that sand is there actually helps it act as erosion control itself. So the bank, because of its porous nature, actually absorbs energy better in that way, instead of reflecting it to each side down into the beach. So, I mean, this is a pretty long letter, but I mean, he had many concerns about basically
We made a
hard
lot of
armor.
progress at that hearing, and he was here and talked about, and the land council guy was here, and then between that hearing and the subsequent one, a bunch of those guys got together, and they had all talked at that hearing about doing that and seeing if they could sort of get their engineering all lined up and everybody come to the same place. And then he was sort of shut off from that, and we heard a subsequent hearing that wouldn't be taking place, and so the communication was flowing, and then it stopped.
Jim Connell also brings up the building, so well, only to protect the building.
Well, I don't know how much we'd want to redesign something we already approved. Granted, we didn't get to what you approved, so.
No, we didn't actually.
Approve it.
Oh.
Yeah.
The last emergency certification was, we had the two where it was, and then with the jute kind of mentioned as a possibility. So, I mean, I think that information's been submitted to some degree. So I don't think, again, one of your roles is to discuss, when you're discussing a positive order, conditions necessary to protect the interest through the performance standards. So if there's a change, well, I know I'm always the first one to say we can't re-engineer projects from the start, but I think looking at projects and seeing what you need to do to have it meet the interest and the performance standards is in your purview. And if you're not going above and beyond, but I also caution with that in this case too, that take into consideration when you start to make changes or substantive changes of what impacts you may be incurring to do those things, or what may be the impact to to the structure that's there, or to the beach, to the bank. I mean, I know you're talking about impacts upon impacts upon impacts, but how that's going to all work together. I mean, our main goal here is to protect the resource areas and their buffer zones.
Right.
So,
Well, and they stated, when we asked them about concerns of removal, they said it was actually quite easy to remove the that they just had to cut the geotextile bags, pull out the sand, and then pull the bags out. So as far as adverse impacts, I think for a redesign or for a removal, that the applicants made it clear that they felt they could do it without too much damage. And we asked them about that on at least one or two situations. The biggest concern, I guess, is, this discrepancy between state and local, and is it something that we could permit? I mean, should we just vote initially or try to get an idea on whether we think that there are adverse impacts and alternatives, or?
We've been fortunate. I haven't seen any adverse impacts down there personally, but it's been a relatively short time frame.
Short time frame and from that perspective of that beach, a very mild winter.
Great.
Right, and still been a lot of coastal erosion at the top, so I'm not sure it's actually
yeah,
slowing the loss of,
Well, that's a whole different dynamic right there. That nothing would say.
But
that.
if you permit something, wouldn't you want to permit something that helps the coastal erosion?
At the top.
Yeah, because that's where the loss of the road will be encountered.
Right, but
Not through any fault of the applicant, but maybe this is still not a design that's going to achieve the emergency certificate.
well, I
goals.
mean, I don't think. Well, from our point of view, at the top of the bank is eroding naturally.
Yeah.
It's doing what it's going to do.
Supposed to
So I
do,
don't think we
yeah.
have any. We're not going to want to redesign anything for the top of it. I mean,
No, I don't
I
think-
wouldn't even touch that.
Yeah.
No, I don't think,
I'm not saying, I'm just
Okay,
saying
well,
with
sorry.
it being there,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
it even achieving what they were trying to achieve as
Well,
far as?
True. Obviously, as the angle gets lower and lower, it'll slow down. But I just feel we've sort of approved the structure to a degree. I haven't personally seen, granted a short time frame. And it's an emergency project, and it's not a permanent, this wouldn't be approving a permanent structure.
Back in the fall,
Well-
there was a lot of talk about asking the DEP to weigh in on the thing. And then what happened? They decided they didn't want to, or?
Well, what's interesting is they weighed in on it, but against their own regulations.
Maybe that tells you where they're going to be coming down.
Yeah. Well, I'm not.
DEP will decide what DEP is going to decide.
Yeah, I
I mean,
wouldn't.
if they want to appeal the permit and supersede it,
They
that's
can.
in their right and their prerogative to do.
I would say as far as the temporary versus permanent nature of the structure, definitely when we first started hearing this and everything up until when we approved the emergency order was presented as this is being put in place while the road gets moved. Since it's gone.
For a period of 2 to 5 years, 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I think 5 years was when I was looking through everything recently this past week, it was up to 5 years as far as that time frame to get the road moved. But what we've heard since then is not that. It's that it's in place and the road will only be moved if the erosion occurs, which the erosion is in theory not going to occur since this is in place. And it's temporary only because it's looking to be replaced by something else.
We've kind of heard different things, haven't we? There were two applicants here, there's a town in.
On this specific application, yes, there are co-applicants.
Right, and so the town is saying, we're going to go forward. Did the DPW director at our last meeting here say we're still moving forward with that? Do I have different recollections?
Well, we don't necessarily have enough.
I think the sense that we got that it was at that point where unless it got triggered, they were looking at the options for moving the road, but doing the actual moving of the road was going to be triggered by the erosion that would occur, which is now potentially not going to occur because the structure is
At least in this
place.
And the FBPF had said that they have a difference of view with the town in any event, because in any event, they want to go for something longer lasting.
Well,
Right.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a difference, but that they have an additional
I think that should be
idea
a
in
whole-
mind to put this
whole
harder.
separate application for something different.
Oh, yeah.
We can't mix these two.
No, I
that's-
didn't. I think it would be.
And I don't think we should consider it in our, you know what I mean? I just don't, this is an emergency.
For
I think
adverse
we're
impact.
complicating it with future plans for this.
For adverse impacts, though, we have to assume it's going to be there 3 years.
Right.
At least
You know,
3
so
years.
Exactly, 3 to
it's your
5.
version of temporary. I mean, that's
Right.
3 years. If we thought there's, and I think there will be adverse impacts, then that's something we
Mhm.
should consider. I don't think we should think it's going to get pulled in 6 months or a year.
No,
You
sure.
know,
It takes 3 years to build a bike path out here.
yeah.
So it's going to take more.
Yeah.
I think the discussion we're having is right on track, but I just wanted to add in that when we talk about things being temporary, those are also things that, if there are concerns of the commission or conditions that need to be put on the project to help it comply to the performance standards and meet the interest, then that's within your purview to do. I mean, if you wanted to, say that, by X date, this project either has to be
Pulled.
pulled or be back in front of the commission for a hearing for extension. I mean, you can certainly condition things like that. I mean, that's totally within there, and that's where it gets conditions for things like monitoring and regular reporting, and those things build up to further analysis by the board. And it may not be the 6 or 7 people that are on the board currently, but when you
Right.
get 2 years down the road, it may be a different crew
Well, that's why.
that's going through it. So.
But it goes back then to whether it can even be permitted with the performance standards we have now.
Yes, well, I mean, they still have to meet the performance standards, but one of the things that we have to do is, when we're looking at it, are there conditions that can be put on the project that essentially aid in its ability or
Right.
get it to meet the performance standards that are there? That's what conditioning is.
There was a suggestion fairly early on from the applicants that they, on that whole question of how to determine what happens in future erosion. Is it, to what extent is it adverse impact from this project, and to what extent might it be a discrete erosion event that's taking place? And they had suggested somewhere putting together a panel of acknowledged experts to advise the commission on that. And that, I thought, was a pretty good idea. I don't know what you guys all think of that, but if there was something like that included, that certainly toward the end of the temporary time window that was described here, or at any point, if that panel's coming up with we're getting the adverse impacts, then it all comes out.
Right. Definitely that is a given.
But what happens if there's an adverse impact? That could dramatically affect somebody else's property, could cost somebody their house.
Well, to me, there was already some adverse
And
impacts.
then it's kind of late to repair it at that point, and taking out the geotubes isn't going to build the house again, isn't going to restore that property.
Well, I would speculate that before, I don't know which house would, if you have a particular house in mind or not, but my speculation is if we started to see, and I don't, from everything I can get from the experts and all the geologists, including the guys that the Quidnet Swamp people hired, they're saying that it's not really knowable. It's not definitive. There's the potential for adverse impacts. I know some of us feel strongly that there are apt to be, or maybe some of us want to say they definitely will be. But I don't see anywhere where any of the professionals have said that.
I would disagree.
I
with
would
that.
disagree. I know
Okay,
Rob Young
so that
said.
would be good. Maybe we could find that, and that would be
Sure.
so that would be helpful. So, but absent that, if we
Got
can't
it right
find
here.
that someplace,
It's right here.
but then we have, if you have some way of measuring, or you have some panel of, if there's such a thing as unbiased, objective expertise that looks at this thing, you can betcha that there'll be people putting red flags in front of them the day after tomorrow about the adverse impacts. And my speculation is that long before, I don't know if there's any particular house downdrift that's at risk, but long before a house went over, we'd be hearing about it. I think that's a little bit extreme to expect that somebody else is going to lose a house immediately if we allow that to stay in there.
Well, as far as, and I've got the letter right here from Rob Young that says specifically what will happen if a wall of geotubes works as designed. It causes beaches to narrow and eventually disappear. So that's the first thing. Erosion's increased at the ends of the wall, and the wall will eliminate the natural sediment supply. So one adverse impact that's occurring is that The tube that's in the beach right now is keeping that beach from eroding naturally. The two tubes
Keeping
above
the bank,
it.
keeping the bank from the beach.
No, beach and bank. The beach is also a sediment source according to our performance standards. So the one that's inserted into the beach is already.
Can we just pause on
Yep.
one of the beach?
Yep.
Are we saying there's a good deal of beach behind?
No, it's-
Underneath. It actually,
They
they
got-
dug out the beach and inserted the tube.
Yeah, and they
So-
put it inside a bag is basically what happened. They
Yeah.
excavated the beach.
Yeah, one full
And
tube.
put it in
Yes,
a bag,
yes.
the bottom bag, yeah.
Yeah, so you say when the beach level gets down below that?
The beach level, so they've already removed the ability of that beach to erode. The beach in front of it can lower as a result of that. So you can
It's
have
probably
it.
going to erode more.
So it's going to, instead of taking the sand in that tube, it's going to take the sand in front of that.
Or the sand that's dumped on in mitigation?
Well,
Most of that's on top of those. It's not in front of the tubes. It's not on the beach itself. It's all on top of the tubes and on the bank. Everything that we've seen them put there now. And part of that's, the reason for that is because that's where they can get to. We've asked them in storms and situations if they could push it down in front of the tubes, and they said they thought that would be difficult to do. But this is from Rob Young's letter. He says, so keep in mind, if a wall of geotubes works as designed, and I think it was designed to work, and in my opinion, over-designed, but that's different for each person, that wall will have the same impacts as a seawall, which are these three things. Beaches narrowing and eventually disappearing. Certainly in the winter, part of that beach already was being reduced. People are having to crawl over what they've built. They've actually cut into the beach itself and put in that bottom tube, and then put the two tubes above. So we've got the sediment source coming from the coastal bank that they have to mitigate for. You can argue that they aren't necessarily mitigating for the beach erosion in front of it that has been replaced with the geotube. So that helps dissipate wave energy. And then you have end scour on the ends, which you're worried about as far as affecting, and whether this is actually even protecting that road at all, if it's being effective and if it's not doing harm.
None of that is talking about the certainty of remote adverse impact at remote locations.
It does say in both his letter and in Connell's letter that some of this beach and sediment source does go both north, goes to the north.
So I know in O'Connell's letter, he talked about some of it does, and it's
Yeah.
hard to know exactly how much, and he gives us his idea of how much he thinks, or the range of it could be, and I know he talks about if it's not properly mitigated, then you would have adverse impacts downriver. And that's what it seems to come to me, is what's proper mitigation.
Right.
Or can you properly mitigate?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
when he sort of puts that big qualifying phrase in there, that says to me that that's a very different sort of statement than it's absolutely guaranteed. I know the lawyer repeatedly says, I can guarantee that the downriver beaches are going to have the adverse impacts, but I haven't heard the engineers say that.
Right. Well, and that's the crux of the matter is, can it be mitigated for or not? And if it can be mitigated, how much mitigation? And we have to go with what they've presented to us. So that's
I agree
the
with
crux.
you. That is the crux.
Yeah.
And the whole business of that word reasonable, and when it comes into play, and that's what we have to figure out.
Right.
And it's important to remember that it's the applicant's burden of proof to demonstrate no adverse impact. It's not our burden of proof to demonstrate positively that there will be. But if there's some reasonable expectation or some expectation that there could be adverse impacts from this project, which I think if you look at, just sticking with beach, all you have to do is go up on the North Shore and look at the seawalls up there. And in the winter, you can't get by them without crawling over the
Seawalls
wall.
that have mitigation are the ones that don't.
no mitigation.
No mitigation.
No mitigation. So I think that's what they're saying. With no
Right.
mitigation at all, you're going to
It's a
have these
given.
impacts.
It's a given, right.
And that's what all of their initial presentations in here were, to make sure that if the project is not properly conditioned, it's going to have these. We're concerned about the potential for impacts, so we're asking you to take precautions
Right.
to either don't allow it or to be sure it's properly mitigated.
Right, which is the whole basis of the regs. And it's the mitigation, it's the cement, the beach, the bank.
Well, and what you can build it for. Once again, the ones on the North Shore are built to protect buildings,
Oh, yeah.
and this isn't.
There is
So
no
that's
s-
the concern.
And all this research is unfortunate and self-admittedly that they don't know about, nourished projects because no one does it.
Right.
So historically, yes, I mean, everything, the toe will undermine, the corners will gouge because there's no mitigation in any of these projects. So we're kind of left out here. We are like a little lab project.
Well, and a lot of the ones in the North Shore and Diana's were the jute and core bags that are then covered over and planted and have the fence in front of them. So they're very different. We're
They're
collecting
very-
data
Right.
on that, and that's a much lower wave energy
Right,
environment.
totally different.
So there's a
system.
lot
and
of
there's a
different-
beach.
Yeah, and there's a beach.
There's
yeah.
nothing left in front here. So
Yeah.
And going back to this conversation we're having, then that 22 cubic yards of mitigation should be on the beach in front of this project, not on the bank on top of the project. So it's available to go into the system then. So we need to separate the sand that goes into covering the bags from the sand that's sacrificial sand. And I think Troy, the land council's geologist, has made that point repeatedly, that there needs to be a difference between mitigation sand and protection sand.
yeah, I mean, I haven't seen it top over these bags. And I heard that it got pretty high on some of them.
Well,
Went up to the
exposed
second
to-
one
Yeah.
when they were constructing it. But I haven't seen anything.
But that one storm exposed the lower bag and half
Mhm.
the one above it,
Yeah,
I think. So, I mean, the sand was removed from both
right.
of
So
those.
we know if you had sand in the leading edge of this, or there isn't much of a surface once
Well, it
you're
would
up.
slow
but
down
yeah,
the waves, yeah.
if you could get it close to the edge at least. I
Mhm.
mean, unfortunately, because you can get a moon tide will go right up to the front of that thing. So if you dump your sand, it's going to go away. You may have it go away before a
that's
storm
real
even
problem,
comes.
I mean, we've got a real problem, but then how do you mitigate this if you need to have that sand present for a storm, but it's going to disappear before the storm because this thing has taken up so much beach already that it's way out there.
Well, and that's where the core bags work better,
Yeah.
because they actually hold on for a while and then release in a big storm instead of just every tiny wave. So that's why I prefer.
They work better for that interest and less effectively for the interest of holding
Right,
it back.
right. It's the
Right.
compromise between the two. What level of protection is going to help and still provide as much of what the bank and the beach are providing? And I think that's the crux of the matter.
And for a temporary project, I guess the question to ask is, with those core bags, if we did just say that's a reasonable alternative, is that
Yeah.
enough to get to the 3 to 5 year mark when we've already been through, in my opinion, we've been through the first winter of the project already, which means we've
Been
got
that long, hasn't it?
2 to 4 more.
I think that, I mean, that's.
That's an interesting point.
I mean, it's
I
already
think it
built,
would
it's
work.
been through
We've
there.
got a
for
half
days.
month, 6
Yeah.
months already.
Yep.
They-
Yep.
they-
You know, there's an alternative. Keep the hearing open for 10 years and just keep doing another certification
Excellent.
every winter.
So that
But
would
I
be
mean, if we,
something.
Unfortunately, don't have that as
if we found the core bags or something that would provide enough protection for them to move
Yeah.
that road, then that's a reasonable
That's a
assumption.
reasonable, yeah.
I mean, that's not saying nothing can be done.
And I think one thing we've witnessed in the last 2 winters is the fact that winters are highly variable. We don't,
Yeah.
I mean, this all came in with, oh my God, we had one of the worst winters in 10 years or so, and it was really bad, and it scared people. But this winter has shown that, well, they're not all like that. This one was, again, on that beach, we had one very moderate kind of north blow.
Well, that
And-
softer solution for the core bags might help us as far as making a finding with the state regs, because I don't think they consider that a coastal engineering structure.
State's
Not
gonna do
jute
what they
or
want.
core.
State doesn't.
Not jute or core, yeah, so.
Oh,
Where the
oh,
geotubes,
so
they
yes,
do.
yeah,
yeah.
okay,
Geotube
fine.
is a-
I'm just trying to think of how,
Same.
because right now it'd be hard to say that this isn't a coastal engineering structure that's in place in front of a building, because it's
Mhm.
not.
Mhm.
And that is a.
Right, my understanding is they could care less about the road.
Yeah.
Right, right. Well, and I'm just, I mean, we've got
Yeah.
2 sets of rules to
Yeah.
enforce. And that would still allow some protection and enough time to reset the road. And I have no doubt if we decide to vote against the project as currently set up, that they couldn't come back very quickly with 2 or 3 jute bags, or if we decide to
On the top.
on the top, or if we decide to permit it with new material and say within 6 months you've got to, I'm just trying to think of things that people would be
Well,
comfortable.
I think with in regards to filing a new application, I don't necessarily think that's overly relevant to the discussion.
No, we.
Right.
Because if the merits of this project meet the standards, then they do, and if they don't, they don't. And if it's to their prerogative to file a new application, they certainly have the rights to do so. I mean, there's standards that go with that for redesigns and reapplication limits and all those fun things, but
Unfortunately, I
That's-
think they don't.
that's up to,
Well,
that's up to each applicant. I mean, we can only deal with the information we've been submitted. Speculating on filing
Yeah,
statuses are.
and I know the project's in place, but the commission did take a vote once that there were reasonable alternatives.
You should support that vote.
And, you know,
Yeah, before we found out that the stuff was not available, or it was represented, it wasn't available, and the commission took a vote to allow the GO2. Back on the December 18th, on the draft minutes, it has the DPW director at the bottom, it says page 3 of 10, saying the Board of Selectmen and the DPW discussed all about the jute wasn't available, and that according to DEP, the Ford GO2 option is appropriate. And
For the emergency certification.
For the emergency
Yeah.
certification.
yes, under emergency certification,
But we can still reasonably find that is not currently protecting a building. I mean,
so that's where the
I mean,
reasonable.
the DEP could have made a mistake.
To me, this is all going to come down to our different views of what we think is reasonable.
oh,
Right,
yeah,
right.
it is,
That-
yep.
Because supposing we just say, okay, take it all out. It's all coming out. And it all comes out, and now you're right back where you were. You're within 24 or 28 feet of the road, and you have an emergency situation, and DEP thinks that GO2s are an acceptable solution for that. And so what do? You go back in and
Put it back
reinstall
in.
it as an emergency?
I know.
And would that be reasonable?
It'd be reasonable to ask them to replace 1, 2, or 3 of them with the softer solution. I don't think that's unreasonable. That's my opinion.
Right,
I
so
don't know
that's
how
going to be a
others
matter of
feel.
viewpoints, and I sure
Yeah.
don't see it as reasonable, but we'll figure out where we go.
So, I mean, that's
As
one way
usual, you and
to,
I have canceled each other out, and the rest of these guys.
So
Well, you can't leave.
We're not getting
You gonna leave?
anywhere. We're getting there slow anyway, kind of winding all over.
as far as the performance standards, wildlife, recreation, flood control, storm damage, it just depends on,
Yeah, I mean, I think, sticking with the beach, I think we've heard from, at least a couple of well-respected experts that these hard structures clearly reduce the volume and the extent of
If not
beach.
properly permitted.
When not nourished.
Well,
They all have that qualification in
Yeah.
their statements.
So,
I don't think that's,
I'm not sure that's
I
necessary.
don't think that's how they worded it.
Mm-mm.
It's definitely not how Young worded it. Or Bruno,
Or O'Connell.
or O'Connell, yeah. And geotubes, temporary sand walls or sand socks were installed along 5 miles of the beach, east and west of Rollover Pass. This is an example of Rob Young's. This is Bolivar Peninsula of Texas. This is much smaller wave energy. The geotubes quickly reduced beach width and steepened the offshore profile without the aid of hurricanes. This erosion was caused by the geotubes reflecting wave energy downward and offshore, causing sand removal.
And does it discuss it there, the mitigation on that project?
was it nourished?
This one, I think, was
Well,
very
again, now we're back to that problem of if we put the
When and
nourishment
how often?
on the beach,
Exactly.
Right.
is it
Yeah.
going to be there by the
Yeah.
time a storm comes?
Yeah, what
And
is-
then
what
that's
is-
when it really
True,
goes.
but I mean-
What is
The storm
appropriate
when the
mitigation,
beach
yeah.
goes, yeah.
Right, I mean,
So how do we mitigate this to, that's my biggest problem with this project, is how do we mitigate this
right.
to
have that.
actually be, just like the fear of which is a reasonable fear, that the bags deflate and then the bank erodes in a big storm. But likewise, I have that same fear. How do we get the mitigation on the beach so it's there to be effective in the big storm?
It's
And
gonna
I'm
get-
not seeing how we're going
It's
to do
going to
that.
get pulled away in the first part of the storm, and then they'll be exposed, and you'll have that adverse impact. I mean,
And we'll be
simple
out there
physics.
attenuating the wave energy suspended in the waves in the first part of the storm, or it'll
The first
all
part
be
of it was, the
swamp,
more
or
that there's sand in the waves, the more those waves are attenuated. So the beginning of the storm, there'll be protection. As soon as they're exposed, then you're going to start digging into the beach around the sides.
Well, the sides seem to be the reasonable place to put it, but a little farther up the beach where storm waves would get them.
You mean on top or?
Well, no, I mean not on top and on each end. Like if you were to mitigate.
That would
we
help
don't have
the
much of
end
a beach
scour,
here,
but not the lowering of the
Yeah, but it would still take that. It would still move that sand off the shore. That shore wouldn't. You put it in front of the bags, and it's just going to be gone quick.
Yeah.
You have a little bit more seaward and landward, space to keep it slow down the erosion of it. Not
Yeah.
much here, but
I think
so
that'd help end
if you
scour
were
a
to
lot.
put larger,
Yeah.
more sand on the ends,
Yeah.
and it wouldn't just be end scour because it's not like the sand's going from the end and going. It's got to if it's moving across the bags, the energy is moving. The stuff in the end will go in front of the bags. So,
But whether it'll stop on the beach or not is.
well, I mean, it's always moving. Everything's
Yeah.
moving. But I mean, I'm just thinking of a place where the waves can get it, but won't take it immediately. But it's like back to the mitigation. So.
And I think it's also important to remember that the mitigation is for the average annual erosion, not for the big events where the erosion really occurs. And when we're going to see impacts to the beach and to not, because, the 100-year storm is going to take, who knows, 5 or 10 times that much sand.
Right.
And
Well, we're still back to the public infrastructure versus the building issue too. I mean, as far as regulatory compliance. So we'd have to be, if we were going to issue
Well,
a
we have to
positive order.
acknowledge we're not meeting the state requirement in some of these properties. I mean, no matter what we put there.
and then there's the vacant lots.
Yeah.
Lots of vacant lots for this.
Yeah. But it's a matter of deciding, do we think something like what's on the property at 79 is sufficient, and for instance, as an alternative to buy enough time to move that road? Because I think I'd say that's probably causing less heartburn, less issues. Or if you want to compromise, going back to the original one, which was 2 geotextile tubes and jute on top. I still voted against that, but that was a compromise that everybody else did.
So I can't find a DEP letter in here in the history. Is that listed under a different?
It's in a different one. Their letter came as part of the appeal
Different
from
one.
the 4 geotube project.
Yeah.
That's where that is from.
And I
was
think
looking
they
at the
said
list.
that they recommended that once jute was there, that jute be used, didn't it?
I don't think they were too in favor of jute.
I thought they were.
No, they approved under appeal the 4 geotube design, the one that
Yeah.
the commission turned down. They later approved after
Right.
appeal to DEP.
But one of the things you gave us is very specific in their
Tells you
discussion
where they're
about
going.
jute.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can find it.
What's one of
Which
those
is-
things too is you got to remember
Which one?
the 4 geotube design emergency is a separate matter. I mean, we can certainly take into consideration one there, but it was never actually brought into the record for a specific application. So we can discuss it. But it's the problem with hearings upon hearings and applications upon applications.
Yeah.
This-
So right
that's
now
one
we
of
have
my
a
issues. This got very, very
Are we
confusing
gonna-
because of
3 geotube application in front of us, and we have to vote, or we have to decide if it's something that we can permit or not.
I think before we start down the path of redesign and those things, that now that we've kind of gotten all that out on the table and what the issues kind of are, is to look at the actual performance standards and see if the project that's in front of you for the 3 geotubes with the issues that you guys have discussed is, in the neighborhood of the performance standards, and then if you feel that it's worth continuing, if there's conditions that can go on that bring it into complete compliance with those performance standards, then you're conducting the analysis that's necessary. And that's, I think you guys have done a pretty good job of identifying what some of the major issues and talking points are that go with these, but now I think you really have to look at what's allowed and what's not allowed and see what performance standards are met. And then when there are performance standards under the state act that are close or are not met, we can come back to those and say, are there conditions that can go on the project that make it meet those performance standards? And then with the local one, you can do the same thing, but the other tool in the toolbox for the local regulations, you also have the ability to grant waivers to those regulations.
And we
Well,
do
can
have
I-
a waiver request, or we,
Yes, we have received a written waiver request.
for which specific standards?
They have to meet it.
Yeah, I wanted to read.
I'll have to
2.
bring it up or pull it out, and I'll let you know.
Can I read like 2.05, the coastal banks, the very first performance standard? Because it's fairly straightforward. So it says, this is just under 2.05. Section B, performance standards. Coastal banks are land within 100 feet of a coastal bank. And they talk about the interests that they serve shall be presumed significant to the interest protected by the bylaw. Basically, it says no new bulkheads, coastal revetments, groins, or other coastal engineering structures shall be permitted to protect structures constructed or improved after 878 except for public infrastructures. Bulkheads and groins may be rebuilt only if there is no environmentally better way to control an erosion problem, including in appropriate cases the moving of the threatened buildings and/or public infrastructures. Other coastal engineering structures may be permitted only upon a clear showing that no other alternative exists to protect a structure that has not been substantially improved or public infrastructure built prior to 978 from imminent danger.
Do you read that to be all with the exception of those for public infrastructure?
With the bulkheads, coastal revetments, groins, or other shall be permitted to protect structures constructed or substantially improved after 878, except for public infrastructure. I see what you're asking. I'm
Well,
not
because
sure.
then it goes, that talks about no, new ones, and then the second sentence begins about rebuilding them. So, I mean, I'm reading that to be those are already existing. And everything that comes after that applying to that, and I wonder if you guys are reading it the same way or not. And I might like to ask,
Yeah. I mean, the way I read it, the coastal engineering structures may only be permitted on a clear showing that there are no alternatives, but I'm sure I'm probably more restrictive reading. How would you read that, Jeff?
I mean, I guess when I'm looking at it there, I think the key sentence that we're looking at is probably that last sentence.
The last one,
The
yeah.
other coastal engineering structures may be permitted only upon a clear showing that no other alternative exists to protect a structure that has not been substantially improved or public infrastructure built prior to 978 from imminent danger. I think the sentence before that obviously is just dealing with existing bulkheads or groins. I think what that's suggesting that even if you have a bulkhead or groin to be rebuilt, that if there's an environmentally better way to do that, that's what you should be doing. And then the one before I think is pretty clear that no coastal engineering structures for anything that's post 78. And our regulation does exempt out public infrastructures, but then looking at the state act, the state act does not. So I think we're obligated to hold to the standard of the state act. That's
even though the DEP is,
Even though they voted, yeah, I would say so.
how could we
Can we see that?
flesh that out? Could we talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
sure.
But as far as how do you get there?
Well, the DEP has issued out their emergency certification to allow for up to 4 geotubes for the protection of the homes in that area. And their appurtenances there too. But they issued that under an emergency certification. And their emergency certifications have always required that the filing of notice of intent be brought to make that permit essentially a whole regular permit as part of that process. Now, if DEP felt that the 4 geotubes were that necessary to abate the emergency, I'd be the first to say that that's what DEP's decision was. I'm sure they vetted it out very similar to how we're sitting around and doing that, and that's the decision that they made. I mean, they obviously view their regulatory standards and review those. I mean, I think.
So the distinction is because they're putting it there for the home. They're allowing it for the homes.
Correct.
So under our local, we have, if we want to, we can allow it for the public infrastructure, and under the state, we can allow it for the homes, if we want to.
Correct, but you'd have to make a specific finding under the state act that dealt with either areas as gap lots for, obviously, if you're protecting, I'll use the classic example, is if you have a home that's here, a 50-foot gap, and then another home that's under protection, DEPs have the policy of allowing that section in between to be filled, because obviously, through lots of research, end effects are a big issue, and to exacerbate a problem on a 50-foot section that's there, they've permitted that before. I mean, there's some good case behind
So
that.
we could say yes to this for protection of the infrastructure, but we can't say that under the DEP for protection of the infrastructure, but they're not going to care. They're going to overrule us anyways.
Well, I'm not even going to guess what the DEP is going to do. The DEP is going to choose to do what the DEP chooses to do. I think your job is to perform.
Fair enough, yeah.
Your job is to perform the analysis by the rules and regulations as they're written, not for what another regulatory board may or may not take action to do. I mean,
Well, that's kind of interesting, because we were at one point anxious for input from the DEP, and we sort of have slacked off of anybody at that end of the table really wanted to hear what the DEP thinks anymore.
well, I would caution that before. The difference is here is the wording from DEP that we received was judged against the standards of their emergency requirements.
Yeah.
And emergency requirements don't have the same performance standards or interests that the regular regulations do. That's why they're an extraordinary process. It's a different, even our local regulations and bylaws, there's a different process and different set of standards for emergency projects, and this is exactly why they always come back for a regular permit to come in and do it, so then you can apply the performance standards if it's going to be something that's going to be there for a great deal of time. Now that an emergency has been abated, permitted correctly with proper conditions, so the project can either stay or be fixed or make adjustments to it as necessary to meet the performance standards.
Great, so we say take it all out, and they take it all out, and then they're back in an emergency situation, and presumably the DEP does what it did before and says, yeah, you have an emergency, go ahead and put it in for 30 days. And then they file a notice of intent, and then we say take it out, and then the DEP says you can put it in, and then we do that until maybe that's a way we can run the
I don't
cost
know
up
if that's
high
how it
enough.
would work.
Well, I don't think it would work that way, but that's,
Yeah, I'm not sure it'd work that way.
you'd have rehearing issues in there too, for the same project over and over again, coming back with the same notice of intent. I don't think I would prefer to judge this case specifically on its merits and hear it out that way, as opposed to what's going to happen one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think that's a lot of speculation and hypothetical situations.
Where I was stumbling on was that earlier on we were anxious to know what the DEP thought, and now to some degree we know what they thought.
Well, on the town website currently, CZM and the DEP have for the coastal management plan two different presentations that talk about geotubes, and it's not their preferred alternative on PowerPoints on the town's website at this moment. So I don't think that they have changed their feelings. I think they weigh each application, including our emergency certifications, individually. And both Jeff and I have sat through, as well as the public, presentations from DEP and CZM, their coastal management experts, that don't consider geotubes to be the best alternative in many different situations.
So you wanna
it's
tell
not. I'm not making up stuff.
You want to tell them to take it all out?
I wouldn't be against that,
Well, let's
but I'm not
Well,
sure
let's-
anybody else would.
now the question all comes up to reasonable alternative.
Right.
Okay, so, and there was some valid argument against the bags, the sand-filled bags. I'm getting all confused here. The core bags and jute, because they didn't hold up one season. It's been so long since doing this. What, a year, 2 years ago, year and a half ago.
But they're down now in front of.
Right,
homes.
but the question is that they lose them in a big storm and then they get a big amount of erosion. So that's a valid argument, which, the state is going to look at, if this goes into a mitigation thing. It's a valid argument that they didn't do their job.
But they're currently now protecting homes.
Well, yes, but...
He had to replace them. He had to
Yeah,
replace
true,
them.
but after he lost 20 some odd feet or whatever, because they went away and then had a big amount of erosion. I mean, I just sort of...
How many years has that taken, though?
Yeah.
Well, I understand that, but
I mean, if you're losing 2.5 feet on an average erosion, if that took 10 years, he's at average. He's not doing too bad.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm looking at it, and maybe I shouldn't, but I'm looking at it the way, the courts would look at it, And
But again, we're looking at something that's got to be there for 3 to 5 years. I mean, that's, again, I mean, this gets very, very confusing because I'm still confused. Is this an emergency situation,
to me,
or is
it
this simply chronic?
Well,
Yeah.
that's why I say it has to have a cutoff date and a pull date.
But then you're going to be right back to an emergency too. I mean, we take this out in 5 years, and it's going to be the same emergencies if we take it out tomorrow. It's no different. In 5
Well,
years, it's going to still be
To
an
me,
emergency.
it's the road. I mean,
But
yes.
do we have the legal right to say, if you guys decide to permit this with a set of conditions,
Mhm.
I don't know if we have the legal right in our conditions to say this can be permitted only upon evidence that the town is actually moves the road. I know we talked about this a little bit last time, and I just don't know if we have that.
Well,
Right.
I mean,
I think there needs to be a drop
Because that
dead
would be
date
more
so
of a,
that
you know
the
what I'm
town
saying?
is-
If you're going to say this is emergency certification and it
Right.
fits the criteria, then how do we ensure that road is ever moved?
well, we write it in that the road has to move. I mean,
But
it's
do we
one
have
of
that
those
power?
things, as part of our argument and our
Yeah.
The one thing we have to remember is, one, that we're not making a decision on an emergency certification.
No,
We're
we're
issuing out
doing
order
it
conditions. So that's that one to some degree. The trouble that you get with trying to permit or putting in a condition requiring someone to do something that may or may not be within your jurisdiction or is within your performance standards, you cannot do. I mean, you
That's
can't,
what I was
you
thinking.
can't throw a condition in that says that McDonald's as a condition. I mean,
Dunkin'
because
Donuts.
because that's not within our performance standards
Right,
or
right.
something that's there. I know
You
it's kind
can't.
of a silly reasoning, but that's a great regulation to maybe add later. But when you condition things, they have to be conditions that relate to the protection of the performance standards.
Right.
And requiring someone to do extra work that wasn't part of the original application that's not necessarily performance standard protection related is not within your ability to do.
You deal with that at the expiration of the permit.
Right. I would say
They'd be asking for the same thing again, and you'd say, well, what did you do in the last 3 to 5 years? You would judge their credibility.
That's sort of what I'm getting at. I mean, just going to be realistic. Yes, in like the ideal world, we'd have jute down there and everything. But I just think realistically,
I think it's realistic. I think it's realistic to have jute there. Though.
Well,
I mean, one thing that was, I think it's, in Connell's letter, he says, while the geotubes may have a longer life expectancy, they have a greater potential adverse impact to beaches and dunes than biodegradable alternatives like core and jute. While we appreciate the intent of having more time to develop long-term alternatives, the use of core jute has been shown to be successful in the short term along the eastern shore of Nantucket, and this will expedite the long-term alternative planning process, like moving the road. So, I mean, you could argue that if you put something that doesn't last as long, then you have more impetus to actually, you're going to do, I honestly do think you'll have
Well,
less
the-
adverse impacts.
I question. I mean, this stuff does actually have a lifespan if it's not treated properly. So,
Yeah.
It could be,
one of the
yeah.
things I like about this stuff is that you can't just sort of just leave it there and not maintain it. Otherwise,
The
you end
trouble
up.
is you can, and then you can't get it out, and then it's going to
Well,
be a
but
mess.
Well, when it
before
comes
it
out,
breaks,
then it's
it breaks and
dangerous, yeah.
becomes right. I'm saying, yeah. So
Yeah.
you have a mess of a synthetic product. All
Yeah,
over.
which is a
Well,
which is
and
another
But at the same
adverse
point,
impact for landowners.
they won't do. They'll
Yeah.
they'll come apart on their own
Yeah.
if they're not maintained, and that to me that is a
I
plus.
see what you're saying, yeah, that's right.
You know, yeah. So.
But with the
So
performance
the
standard-
reasonable alternative is the big key word. That's the little.
Yeah.
Right, and what is reasonable
That's the
versus,
catch to all these, and most
Yeah.
all these rates we're going to run into. So
Well, I think just to go, I know you have to judge everything on its own merits, but this commission has practically universally gone for soft solutions to avoid these, because we thought they were more reasonable. And they can be effective, and
We've gone for the minimal solution to do the job.
Excuse me.
Which I think is less than what's proposed.
Right, and the engineers have said this is what it takes to do the job. Now you have other disciplines and other expertise concerned about potential adverse impacts saying, won't you please do something else so that we don't have to worry about this potential for adverse impacts, but they're not saying this will do the job.
Well, we're not engineers. I mean, we have to
Well,
make...
there's more than one job.
There's more than one job.
Well, exactly, that's,
Yeah, the job is
Yeah.
not just protecting an
And that's
empty lot
the
or
discussion.
Yeah,
or
it's back to
slowing
it's
erosion.
what's reasonable.
Yeah.
Well, and as far as what's reasonable, that's why earlier I brought up the idea that there seem to be some changing perceptions about how long this is intended to be in place. And, you know, if there are inclinations that it might be there longer than 5 years, or that that's what's wanted is longer than 5 years, then I do think it's reasonable to at least consider asking for the hybrid solution versus what's in place now. I don't think that's unreasonable given the potential length of time that it might be in place. And that is essentially replacing one bag, one GO2 bag with
Yeah.
jute, which would help, which in my mind would at least help balance both of those two interests of protection and the
Right.
function of the bank.
Yeah, and there's no way you can say that's not a reasonable alternative. I mean, that's not asking for anything hideous.
And we did sort of
We did
And that we
come
voted
to a
on.
general agreement that
Yeah.
that was something we,
kind of indicated we would
Right.
expect
We'd
that,
be
but
supporting ourselves.
it wasn't what we got when the
Well, point.
NOI came out,
Right.
even when we asked for it. So, you know, I don't know that they would find that to be, that they would acquiesce to that.
But that's a reasonable finding, to say we previously thought 2 + 2 worked. It was a compromise between the major protection of the tow and providing the most accurate mitigation at the time of big storms from jute. I mean,
Right.
that's certainly not onerous or mean or whatever.
Well, that could be the basis of where we just go from here. If a majority of the commission thinks that there are reasonable alternatives, then we start crafting a denial.
I think that's fair.
You want to take a vote on that and decide where we are on the question of reasonable
Can I
alternatives?
hop
I
into
think Jeff
something
wants
real
to
quick?
speak.
Yeah.
One of the things that's there, especially as we talk about temporary or interim or the life of the project, is you have to remember that our original order of conditions is for a period of 3 years. So if you guys are going to condition a date within there for removal or review or whatever is set up in there, it has to be within that 3-year lifespan. Because then when you come back for an extension, I mean, you're essentially applying for an extension to the board, and there's criteria to meet for that extension. I mean, that's barring any outside help, like the governor extending permits 2 or 4 years just because he likes to.
that would
But-
affect this one. Would that affect this one?
No, that would not. That one, this one is currently outside, unless he does it again. But
But if he does it
but
again.
you're
it would
really
affect
looking at an effective permit life of 3 years. So
Yeah.
Which is still a long
without
time.
without ongoing conditions or conditions that are continued via, either the permit still running on or certificate of compliance with ongoing conditions. I mean, you're really looking at, if that's a condition that the commission would want to put on a positive order, you're looking at a date that's within 3 years to deal with.
But
Now, you could come back and extend it and
Can we-
amend the permit to push that out again, but I would hope, and if I'm still here, I think I would encourage that commission or applicants to say, if we're going to consider any sort of extension, we need to have data and information that clearly shows what impacts we've been seeing, what impacts we didn't foresee, and have I hate to say redo kind of what we're doing now, but almost kind of redo what we're doing now for what they've seen. I mean, that's...
But going back to our original, if there's a reasonable alternative, like what we had voted on before, then I think that's a good place to start. What do you all think?
I mean,
I didn't hear the second half.
Oh,
of that.
pardon?
I didn't hear the second half of what you just said.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying what we were discussing before is whether we thought there was a reasonable alternative and something similar to what we had
The
voted.
hybrid.
The hybrid, which was voted
Can
on.
we write that into it?
Well, I think,
that we can.
I think
I
this
don't
is,
think we
this is
can.
a pretty simple, I don't want to say it's a pretty simple question, because it's not, because I can say it because I don't have to vote, but I think when you're looking at it, this is a standard that we're going to see repetitively through all of the resource areas, both locally and the state-wise. That, I mean, just looking at the coastal bank here under the state for a coastal bank determined to be significant to storm damage prevention is under B here, under 3B, the applicant demonstrates that no method of protecting the building other than the proposed coastal engineering structure is feasible. It's kind of that same thing. Alternative.
Feasible,
It's
that's not
feasible.
reasonable, yeah, that's feasible.
So ours deals more with the reasonable, but it's something we're going to see multiple times. So we can kind of knock out a chunk of performance standards kind of in a fell swoop with you guys coming to a determination on the feasibility or alternatives for what's there.
Well, and it goes on to even, just in our local performance standards, all projects shall be restricted to activity as determined by the commission to have no adverse impact on bank height, bank stability, wildlife habitat, vegetation, wetland scenic view, or the use of the bank as a sediment source. That's independent of the,
No adverse
Yeah.
impact.
I think that's a different discussion than the
Yeah, that's a later
alternatives and
discussion.
feasibility.
yeah.
Those are
But-
different questions. But I think the feasibility or alternatives is an important question to answer at some point.
And that's under the state that you just read?
Yeah, that was just under the coastal banks in the state, but I mean, it's the same.
But if there's no adverse impacts, do you really need reasonable alternatives?
Well, I'd say if there's no adverse impacts, then
We wouldn't be having this discussion.
no,
There's definitely
we would
So
not.
I think some of us at least think there's going to be at least some adverse impacts.
Or potential. I mean,
Potentially,
I
yeah.
think we all agree that there's a potential for adverse impact.
In all structures.
If you
Have the
if you
same.
don't do, if you don't condition it properly. So,
Well, and it's not their fault, but I don't think that they can mitigate, when they need to mitigate, in a way to keep that, I'm not even sure it's possible. Not at all their fault, but when you need to add sand is in the middle of a storm when you can't get equipment out there. So I would argue that it's difficult to even provide appropriate mitigation. That's the nice thing about the jute bags, even though they get torn up, they're acting as guys with containers of sand at the time of the storm. They're breaking out at the time of the storm without any of us being in danger. So that's one advantage that's been
At the
recognized.
expense of stability of the bank.
At the expense of having to reinstall
At the
that.
expense of the stability of the bank.
Well, potentially.
Potentially,
some.
yeah, that's once
But
again.
they
the-
should reduce it substantially
Yeah.
because they're going to.
We have testimony during the hearings about how that took place and how much bank was lost when that happened.
And that depends on how much the jute bags deflate. You know,
Yeah.
it's some loss of sand from jute bags doesn't create that situation. So there's a gradation of what kind of storm will
Yeah.
affect
How
what
severe the
happens
storm
to
was.
it. Exactly.
Right? And, yeah, Paul,
Right.
yeah,
So it's not a guarantee that when the jute bags start to give sand that you will have failure of the bank behind it.
Right.
It will
no, but it has been demonstrated on that site that if that continues throughout a storm.
Right, that if you
that's
get
the
an
next thing
extreme
that
large
happens.
storm.
The whole thing's been, the
But
whole
it's-
thing is moot and it didn't do it failed to do what it was designed to do.
But it's been there 5-6 years now, and it's performed pretty
The
well.
purpose of the
3-4
purpose
years.
of the application is to stabilize the bank. And so when you condition it to doom that to failure, you got to. I don't see that as reasonable.
Well, any of these systems can fail. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see this differently. It's all right.
these
talk from your mic.
geotubes can get undermined and fall over and therefore fail. And there was a case 2 winters ago of a rock revetment on the vineyard that failed, and then the bank eroded behind it. So anything can fail.
Right. The question for us is it reasonable to ask the applicant to do something that has been demonstrated to fail on that site? And if we think it is, then
Or did it fail, or did they function as designed?
they failed to do what they were designed to do, to
No,
stabilize
they
the bank.
didn't. They're designed to lose sand gradually and at least slow erosion of the bank.
Well, here, one thing we've got that says that it significantly slowed erosion at 79 Baxter Road from April 2003 to March 2012. So we do
Then
have.
read on, read the rest of it?
Yeah, I can hand this down or read it out
Which day
loud.
do you want?
This is the Nantucket Land Council's letter, and it's the third page. Memorandum, October 30th, 2013. This is the alternatives analysis. Well, let's jump ahead. This is further confirmed by, and they refer to Epsilon Associates, Inc., from their 2013 NOI for Baxter Road and Sconset Bluff Storm Damage Prevention Project. The key disadvantage listed and exclusion of this alternative is degradation of the material over time. However, the proposed project is temporary, not permanent, thus degradation of the jute material. So they're referring to a presentation that was given by Epsilon.
So I was remembering the SBPF chairman out on Baxter Road talked about exactly what happened and how much.
But I'm not sure, do we have that in that, well,
It's in the-
we have what we have.
It's in here someplace, I don't know exactly where it is. And he talked about how much was lost. And
Well, here, they're saying that it protected it for a significant amount of time.
yeah,
so-
until that particular.
Until that bad storm, yeah.
Until that event came on them, and that's when it failed. And I think, I think it's, does it go without saying, do we all see this the same way, that the reason these people, the reason the town and SPPF are applying for this is to stabilize the bank? That's sort of what,
Right.
what's fundamentally about this, and what all the concern is about the effects that could have elsewhere.
Right.
And so,
Or there.
Right.
and so, for me, the question of reasonable starts to turn on requiring them to do something that's been demonstrated to be counter to what their primary purpose is. Just,
Well, it's just the extent of stabilization. In other words, you're looking at the continuum, as Jen mentioned before. You've got everything from seawalls to just nourishment. And so you've got to decide how much protection.
well, how many
Will
feet do
help.
we have? We have 29 feet, and the road is closed at 25?
At 25.
We have 4 feet left?
Where? Where is there
Where?
only 4 feet left?
No, it's a
There's
20.
a couple spots up there, maybe.
So
To the-
that's the whole
to the
point.
cutoff
If you-
line.
If you,
It's not
if you get that storm and you wipe it, and it's all for naught, then how reasonable is it to require them to do that? And each of us can figure out what we think of that.
Sure.
Well, I think, Mike, if it was that simple, that would be our regulations. What's going to work the best? But instead, we have all these conditions and requirements.
Well, our
and other
regulations,
requirements that we
except
have
for
to-
public infrastructure.
Well, except that
It doesn't work for
Well,
the state.
we need to try to design or help come up with a project or condition a project so that the other interests that are protected by the laws are met. And that's
Our
often a
job
balancing
is, our
act.
job is to protect all the
Right, so you have a
interests.
near certainty on one hand that you're going to lose the road, and you have concern about potential adverse impacts if it's not properly conditioned on the other hand.
You've already got a loss of the beach just installing the geotube, so I wouldn't say that this is just a potentiality. We've already lost the beach that's been dug out, filled in with the geotube. That's no longer serving wildlife, scenic view, or habitat. I don't think anyone would argue if you dig a big hole, put a big bag in there and fill it full of sand, that it acts as the same habitat as the beach by itself. So there's already, you're saying only about potential impacts far away, and to me, in my mind, I'm considering a variety of impacts, which include the use of the beach as a habitat, the wetland scenic views there, the loss of the beach right at that location, not just Enscour and Longshore Drift. I think there's a variety of interests that.
Yeah, so you see it as reasonable,
Well, any,
to have them take this apart and rebuild it. It's stuff that's going to fail when the storm comes.
Yep.
one thing about any structure that we would permit, it's going to take up beach. It's going to cover up, you're not going to have, it's not a habitat.
Right.
So any structure we permit is going to have that issue too.
Right.
So really, it's a matter of nourishment.
Well,
It's a
and
matter
how it
of
breaks down and how it
yeah,
acts.
exactly. But basically, it's the concern of whether there's going to be enough sand.
And was,
And when?
was there nourishment in front of the textile bags that were there? Did they have 22 cubic yards of nourishment in front of them when they failed?
Mhm.
I don't think so.
Oh, what the?
Yeah,
79.
Weimar's.
Okay. No, I don't think
So-
there was a nourishment component, much of a
No.
nourishment component in those, because the sand inside was considered part of the system too.
Well, yeah, going back, that sand releases when it's
Mhm.
needed most.
Right, I understand that.
I think the applicants have tried very hard to provide mitigation. I'm not sure that it's doable in a close enough manner to mimic what needs to happen from that bank and beach. For the protection of the
Yeah.
road, too. I mean, I don't want them to design something that not only causes adverse impacts, but doesn't help.
Mhm.
You know, that ability to deflate, just like crumple zones on a car,
Right.
really makes a difference in absorbing energy. And the geotubes are known to deflect and refract energy. I think for the first 10 or 15 minutes or 10 or 15 hours, once that sand's taken, it's going to absorb it. But then I think it's going to, I mean, I don't think it's been documented that it's going to reflect, and lower the beach.
Yeah. Thing is, if you're going to have crews working down there rebuilding tubes on that short of beach, and it is a short beach there, he's got more beach down the way. You're going to have that constant battle with, are they working in the surf line? Are they,
Sure.
available time frame to work in
Yeah.
the winter season down
I
there?
think we're putting more danger with the geotubes
I know.
than with the jute, honestly.
Yeah, I understand your point. I mean, I understand your position. I really do, and I respect it. I'm just trying to get something that works.
Which is very,
I-
very hard on a beach like this.
Yeah.
There are extreme conditions.
Yeah, personally, there is the increased activity down there more of a concern. There's a lot of activity. It's pretty
I
intense
think we're going to
sea.
have a lot of activity regarding.
For that distance of bags, it's a huge amount of activity for rebuilding projects.
But they've had to get down there constantly just with the mitigation on top of the geotubes too.
Oh, the fronts of the bags covered now?
Yes.
Oh, very
Yes.
good.
So they've had to,
I know
it's
that took
just
a
a
while.
constant,
Yeah.
I mean, you could argue just on temporary safety, it's probably not advisable either
Well.
way. I somehow lost all the performance standards that you gave us.
What can
Well,
we do to
we've got
keep?
about,
What can we do to move forward
20
here?
minutes before 6 o'clock here, so.
Okay. Yeah, well, so what do we think?
Well, I haven't heard anything from Ian. What's Ian thinking? 'Cause
Yep.
we sort of
Sleep.
have a general idea what-
He's gone swimming.
Yeah, Ian, are you still there?
Well, yes, I am still here, and it's different trying to participate over the phone as opposed to in person, and discussing the ambivalence between emergency versus a permanent application, geotubes versus choir. I take exception, I think, to Jeff's reading of the local bylaw, only in as much as that I don't think that bulkheads, and when he read bulkheads and groins may be rebuilt only if the Commission determines there is no environmentally better way to control an erosion problem, including, in appropriate cases, the moving of the threatened buildings and or public infrastructure. I think that stands alone rather than actually being an integral part of the performance standards, Section 1. I don't feel that there are absolute private interests. I think that the state is moving away from that, and certainly DEP, and in the last 3 or 4 years, has been moving away from advocating any hard structures, but specifically to what we are looking at here, I do think there are alternatives. Thank you.
So should we have just a vote on whether there's reasonable alternatives and see what we use, how we use that information?
Sure.
Is that fair?
You guys can make decisions. I mean, deciding whether there's feasible alternatives or reasonable alternatives is going to have bearing on both the state act and the local bylaw.
Yeah.
I mean, the first
helps
performance
us.
standard in a lot of these is whether or not that's the case.
Mhm.
And I think a determination from a majority of the board to say that there is or there isn't, obviously is going to start steering the conversation in a direction for, you know, the drafting of a positive order or
Denial.
a negative order. I mean, that's, and if we do other performance standards and reach those same decisions, I mean, they may not always be the same, but
It's the same problem for each one of these.
yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately the decisions you guys have to make. I know when we do regular applications with less pieces involved, we kind of take them as a whole. This is one where there's enough parts that the discussion merits going through.
And again, I
The
think we
majority
need
of
to
it, so.
keep in mind that we're looking at reasonable alternatives for a project that I believe we're considering permitting for another 2 to 4 years or so.
For 3 years.
Well,
Yeah.
So Ian, you're saying that you, I would agree with you
Well,
that
wait, let's have a motion and a vote
Okay.
then. Do I have a motion to sort of poll the commission to see if we believe there's reasonable alternatives?
so moved.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, I'm going to have to do a voice. Ian, did you hear the motion?
Yes, not completely. The motion is that we're voting on whether or not there are reasonable alternatives to the geotubes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And so I vote aye.
Okay. Jen?
Yes, there are reasonable alternatives.
Aye.
Sarah? Aye. Ernie? Aye. Andy?
Let me add to it. I could see there being a hybrid of what exists there. So I'd say aye on the point that there could be a modification of what is there,
Okay.
especially if it would get this finished up.
Mike?
No.
Okay, that motion carries with Commissioner Glowacki opposed.
5-1.
And Andy kind of sitting on the...
Well, it's not really sitting on the fence. I
gotta
don't
be-
think it's a black and white situation. I tend to think that what's there hasn't proven itself to be harmful. But we did in the beginning talk, and there was a general consensus of agreement that something of a hybrid would work. And I just want to be realistic with what's there and what we've seen, and what the shortfalls, potential shortfalls of it.
Well, I think realistically, if push came to shove, it's not that difficult to replace the top tube with a jute tube. I think that's doable.
Well, that's sort of what I'm thinking. If you switched out the top one for the jute bag or something.
Which we expected them to do, and I think the state was also.
Right. I
expecting
think that wouldn't be as radical as. I'm not necessarily in favor of it. I'm actually personally not really in favor of it. I don't think really a jute system is going to. I see that as being a big mess.
Yeah, whether it's a reasonable alternative.
I don't really see it as a reasonable alternative as a full jute system.
The idea is to make this cost more money and do it to
Well,
failure.
Yeah, your motion got a little followed up there. I would clarify because your motion. No fault of what you did. When you
The
you
motion.
made a motion to poll everyone,
Right.
and then you polled people, and then you got sort of a discussion from Andy. So if you intended to vote a finding on the reasonable alternative, then I would recommend you make another motion.
Yeah, I know.
think it was
Okay.
certainly helpful what you did, but
Yeah.
it's not a very
Right.
effective motion.
So why
in
don't you
terms of a
state, and
finding.
then we'll ask somebody to state what motion you would like us to make, and then we'll...
Well, I would say a finding. I can move a finding that the commission finds that there is a reasonable alternative to the 3 geotubes as presented by the applicant. That's very straightforward.
You do have a second.
Second.
Mr. Chairman, we have to have discussion on that before you vote it, please,
Okay.
Yeah.
because I do have, I just can't conceive that it's reasonable to ask people to do something that's destined to fail on that site at a greater cost. I don't see how reasonable comes near this. I get that there are other alternatives, but what is reasonable is, this is just beyond me. Thank you for allowing me.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same sort of view, and I'm just concerned that a cut and dry statement, an aye, is not stating my point.
Well, the next door, or currently, we don't have anything right now that's 2 geotubes on the bottom and 2 on top, so we don't have any examples.
We don't have it written in front of us as an applicant.
No, but we don't have any
We
to
can't.
compare it to either. So comparing to
Well-
something that's failing with the lower geotubes isn't exactly the same thing scientifically as...
Yeah, but I understand. I think we don't have anything to compare with what we have down there now. I have a feeling that what's out there is not what's out there in all the research is not what we have down there.
Mm.
So I think we're in that situation already.
And it could even be that there might be a better way to mitigate it, that could improve the project too.
Well, that was sort of the idea of having a JPEG on top. That was in
That was
a
it.
zone that wouldn't be attacked.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a reasonable, to me, it's a reasonable alternative. It's not saying pull out the entire project and let it all go.
And we
It's
can't
not-
write that. We couldn't write that into sort of.
It could be.
We have to make a
It could be
finding.
having
That's what I'm
smaller
wondering.
bags on the back and 4 bags in the front, or something like
there's all
that, that
kinds
would
of-
slow down the rate of loss.
Mm-hmm.
You know, instead of having, 22 cubic yards of loose sand out there, use those smaller bags and stack them on the back and then put some core bag. I mean, there's things that, I think if they were creative,
Well, there's wave dampeners, there's tons of all kinds of things.
Well, I'm just wondering, instead of just like nixing the whole notice of intent for another one, I mean, is it, we can't modify what they have?
no.
No.
I think re-engineering something
Well,
for conditions
definitely.
is a very perilous path.
I know, but the
If-
same thing, it seems to me that was presented to us
No,
at
but
one
if it were more
point.
mitigation or different mitigation, that's a
It's
tweak of
different.
what's there.
But-
If that's what the chairman is talking about doing.
Yeah.
It seems like
Sure.
the hybrid was presented to us at one point, and I'm not sure why.
Well, we
Well,
voted
that was
for it,
presented as an emergency
Yeah,
certification request.
and then they presented the
What
3...
this- well,
It was also presented as the emergency option because we'd had this same vote within the discussion of an NOI
yeah.
Mhm.
and come to this conclusion.
It was this
It just
NOI.
didn't come back
Mhm.
later,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
exactly.
We've just come in like full circle from 5
Yeah.
months
So-
of talking.
So the motion is to make a finding that the commission finds that there are reasonable alternatives to the 3 geotubes proposed by the applicant. That's just a finding.
Yeah, I understand.
Sharon, can I make a request that if you're going to make a finding, that you actually use all of the clauses in the act? You're only looking at a little piece of what the actual sentence says in its finding.
We can,
So, in other words, what I really mean is that
for the finding that,
we're really, I would suggest you're really supposed to be talking about whether or not it protects the structure and whether or not it protects it from the imminent danger. And you're only looking at whether or not there's something else out there, and not whether that something else out there protects the structure from the imminent danger. So I'd ask through council or through the chairman that you consider making a finding that addresses all of those points.
well, the finding
Well, I
just
think
has
we're
to be
looking at-
Yeah.
Look at the waiver.
at the waiver and at the, yeah,
Or
that
the
doesn't,
feasibility.
Yeah, I think you have it. The only thing that I'd clarify is the first time you said that there is a reasonable alternative. The second time you said that there are reasonable alternatives.
okay,
That's a
so,
different motion.
yeah. So,
I mean, I know people don't like lawyers, but
right.
That was a valid point.
They like our own lawyers, though.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if it would change the vote, if it's is or are.
you just want to make sure it's the same motion.
This
Right.
is also just polling the.
Well,
This
no,
is a motion to make
this
a
is
finding.
actual a motion to make a finding. We just did.
One suggestion while I'm talking, then I'll shut up. Is,
No, it's helpful.
I would, depending on the vote on that, I would follow up with, based on evidence in the record of what that reasonable alternative is, or what those reasonable alternatives are, depending on what your motion is. I think that would be important to do. You're not re-engineering the project, you're just forming a basis for that finding.
Mm-hmm. So for discussion, do people
Like
think
that.
that there's for sure one reasonable alternative, which is the hybrid that we voted on before? Or do you think we should allude to more than one? What's the easiest?
Well, I think maybe we should be a little more general than that and say reasonable alternatives that will provide a more measured and therefore more natural rate of sand release.
Such as, but not limited
Such
to.
as, Because I still wonder if it would be better off to make that bottom bags, make those lower bags smaller and put a quarter.
And then are you finding that this reasonable alternative is as effective in the prevention against, in stabilizing the bluff? Or are you finessing that point?
You would be saying that it is a reasonable alternative for providing, for serving the job that the bluff does for sediment supply.
So are you
So,
changing establishing a hierarchy that you're weighting one of these interests above another?
We've got about 7.
Mike. We're trying to balance them here. is
You've
what
got
we're trying to
wetland
do.
scenic views, you've got,
That's, in my mind, what we're trying to do is find a
Find a
balance
balance.
between protecting the bank and protecting the other interests we protect, like the bank as a sediment source, and trying to protect that interest as well, because that's an equal interest as protecting the bank.
And so in terms of this, the word reasonable, I mean, we think it's reasonable to do something that's doomed to fail in a storm of that magnitude?
I don't think it's doomed to
I
fail.
think there are things that you could design that wouldn't necessarily be doomed to fail. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but I don't know why.
There's not an engineer that's been in here that's told us there's anything else that'll work for
I
that
think
storm.
a lot of them have told us this won't work.
I think,
To
yeah,
provide a sediment source or protect the beach or,
or to do anything but undermine the beach underneath it, I mean.
So
Anyway,
that's-
so
that's-
going
that's
back
the
to,
That's the mitigation. It's just, my question is, are we ranking one of these interests above the other? It seems to me that we are. That's the drift that I'm getting, and I'm just trying to clarify if that's our intention, or if I'm misunderstanding.
I don't think that's the intent. The intent is, as Ernie said, to balance the two interests.
So on the testimony, I'm sorry I can't find it now, but on the testimony that we had about the what magnitude storm that was, and when the jute failed, and how much of the bank was lost at that time, do we
I
just
can't
not,
find it either.
do we
But
just
that's a
not find
different
that?
system than one of the
That's-
alternatives that we've been
Do
discussing.
we find that testimony credible, or not at all? We don't think that much of the bank was lost?
that's a totally different system than what's proposed or what the hybrid was. That's got different amount of mitigation, so that doesn't mean it's not, that it's credible or not credible. I mean, I'm sure there was some loss there, but that doesn't mean all jute's doomed to fail, that it can't possibly be designed with less than 3 geotubes in a manner that still protects the coastal bank and yet also protects the other interests that coastal bank and area serve. So you're saying that the only thing that'll work is 3 geotubes as designed by the
Well, I'm saying the
applicant. And
engineering-
I'm saying that there's other things that
I'm
would
saying
work.
that's what the engineers have told us.
That's what
And
some
what we've
engineers
said-
have
that's
done.
what
well,
the
I think you
engineers
have
have.
to, I don't think engineers have always just
The best
the
one.
most straightforward agendas either. I mean,
Well, yeah, so
Their
now if
job's
we're going
not
to
to protect-
personalize it and get into whose agenda and which people we prefer, that takes us way around the bend.
Their job is different than ours. Ours is to protect the interests that we are told to uphold. Their job is to design something that will be bulletproof, that will last through any storm they think is likely to occur,
Any
up
storm
to
they-
the 100-year
Any storm
storm.
they think is likely to occur.
Right. We have
That's-
totally different jobs,
Well, that's,
you know? That's totally different
we
ways of
haven't
looking
had
at
an
things.
engineer, and I'll bet you a cookie that if there was a coastal engineer available out there, that the equipment, well, that one of the interest groups would have had them in here telling us that this is over-designed.
The land council's, that isn't coastal
They're
engineer.
geologists.
The Trayvon, yeah, he is a coastal, he works for Applied Coastal. I mean, we can pull out his CV, but I think you could consider him a coastal engineer. He is a coastal engineer. We've had one coastal engineer specifically in at least 2 or 3 different things say it's over-designed. So we have had a coastal engineer say this is overkill. And all we're voting on right now is if there's a reasonable
You know, it's
alternative.
the word reasonable that's got me,
Everyone has something.
pondering, offering
think-
an amendment to strike the word reasonable, then we could be unanimous, yes, there are alternatives. Are they reasonable is where I'm hanging out.
Sure, that's,
and it's not an
That's-
easy, and this is not easy
yep,
for anybody.
that's a reasonable thing, word to get stuck on.
And I have to say, to vote on that personally, I'm not an engineer. And as I think about it,
One engineer did say it's
well, part of me,
over-designed.
it's that problem I'm having is I don't have a problem necessarily with what's down there. Okay. Yes, could it be improved? Maybe. And it is a big maybe because I'm not an engineer. I mean, we do see these bags deflate. And I'm not sure if just by us putting one or two up on top is going to make much of a difference. And if the front of the bag is, the front of the lower bag is going to be exposed no matter what, you're still going to have a hard surface. So, yes, the sand will be going into the system, but you're still going to have a hard surface.
Yeah, I mean,
900 feet
I
of hard
wouldn't have-
surface. So,
So to me,
I'm
the
just wondering
alternative-
if there's a nourishment, if maybe an alternative might be just a better nourishment setup somewhere or layout. I'm not talking quantities, but locations. So I don't want to nix this particular what's down there personally because it's not so cut and dry. It's just
I want to remind the commission, every project that we see a plan with an engineer's stamp on it. That's an engineer that says, this is the project to do this job, and we question them all.
and we've seen them all.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. I understand.
And we use our own experience, our own expertise to question engineers.
See,
And
and-
common sense. Sometimes common sense wins out.
Well, and a reasonable alternative to me would be 3 core bags with appropriate mitigation in front. We don't know that wouldn't survive if it was actually mitigated well with the, I can see a reasonable alternative that I don't think is onerous, that I think would protect the interest better. That's the only thing I'm voting on.
And you think about how wide these geotubes are. I mean, they're a big
Huge.
oval.
Yeah.
You've got plenty of room to work down there. You could have 2 layers of core bags down there. I don't know. You could really get some protection and have a lot of sand there that would be released in big storms.
Exactly at the moment of the storm.
And still have room for those small bags you're using for the returns on the stack behind them for when it hits the fan.
Are much easier to plant with beach grass. I mean, there's a lot of advantages to core and jute, which is what the state's recognizing, which is what Florida's recognizing, that there are ways to actually build systems, soft systems that actually can be vegetated. So the jute can be vegetated a lot better than geotextile.
Well, I think part of the problem with this is getting off the mark, but I think part of the reason they probably lost 20 feet on the previous project is because they're not letting the banks go back to a comfortable angle. And
So it's gonna slump
so
the
by planting the grass might not net at that point in its time,
Yeah.
its slope might not be the healthiest thing for the bank.
Right.
I
Well,
don't
and I
know.
think that's going
Not in the long
to,
run.
I
You're
think
going
the
to get
same
those slumps.
problem's going to happen even with what's designed now. I mean, you're saying you don't really see a big problem with what, I still am not convinced it's helping.
Well,
protect the
that's
stability.
valid. Yes,
Yeah.
you can see the conversion.
If a lot of it's
So
erosion
that-
at the top,
Yeah.
then no matter what you put at the bottom.
I
then we
understand.
still- I just don't want to cause a lot of harm and still not even mitigate the situation they're trying to fix. That's an even greater concern for
Yeah.
me. Anyway, talking and
Okay.
talking. And it's
Okay,
almost,
so
it's
let's go
6
back-
o'clock right now.
Let's get our
so-
vote done here.
Yeah, let's get this vote.
Okay, so let's see, the motion is,
To make a finding that there is, and this would be a singular, I think there's more than that, but do you care if it's singular or plural? Do you care? Do you care if it's singular or plural?
Singular,
I'm
probably the
not
better
sure.
way
You're going to
to
make the
go.
motion that you want to make, so.
I'll make a finding that there is a reasonable alternative to the project as proposed.
Second.
okay, Ian? Ian, you there?
Ian?
Oh, God. Ian, dude.
Ian, can you hear us? Is it
Oh, wow.
still?
It's still on.
Hello?
Jesus.
Awesome.
Oh, okay.
Try turning him up.
Yeah.
He's up there next.
It's karma, man.
Ian, can you hear us?
Oh, God.
Well, start and we'll.
We'll see. Okay,
Finish
Jen?
on him. Aye.
Sarah?
Aye.
Ernie? Aye. Andy?
I'm going to say nay on this.
Okay, Mike?
No.
Okay,
That's-
so right now we're at a 2-3.
3-2, yeah.
So even with Ian, you'll get 3-3.
Ian?
Do you have?
I don't
No, I
think we
don't
have
know.
him.
No, I don't know what I was going to say.
Well, I
Can
would
you
prefer
recall?
to I would
What did he say
prefer
before?
that.
Well, he said aye the
Aye.
first
I
time.
said
Yeah.
four.
We
Yeah.
did, but
But
The question is on
Do
the
you have a
vote that we're
suggestion for
taking
this
now,
one?
the question is not on a
Try to
vote.
get him back
We
on.
took
I
the
know,
program.
I'm just.
we're aware of that.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, just
we
try calling him
can't,
back.
Ian, are you there? I don't know. He's on the conference line, so. I don't know why he's not there.
If he had hung up, he would have.
We would have been, yeah, we would have heard the big buzz. I hope
Maybe
he
his
didn't-
phone's on the fritz or something.
hope he didn't fall off the cliff.
I'm trying to find
Like,
his.
What's going on out there?
Yeah.
It doesn't help to text him because he's on the phone.
So given that I have to leave soon, what is our next step?
Well,
Probably
even
we're
3
gonna
to
do-
2, that's still, we found a reasonable alternative, so then we
But
need
I
to.
think that's only part of what we were doing.
Well, so
There's
we'll reconvene this
still more
process. Do we
discussion.
have to close this or anything, or?
No, you would essentially, I mean, our next date for our next public meeting would be next Wednesday. It's our regularly advertised hearing. You can continue, and keep in mind that I
Well,
wouldn't like enough time to,
I
you know,
got a message
to
from
try
Ian.
not to turn around a draft order and.
You have a
like,
message from Ian?
Got cut off a few minutes ago. Text Jeff, tried to call back a couple of times.
Huh.
No avail, Ian.
Maybe if you hang up,
Hang
we
up.
can call him back.
Yeah, go ahead and
Try now.
text him to try now.
This could take about 10 minutes.
He can.
I gotta call back in.
I will point out that next week's meeting, I have to leave at 6 as well, from the next week's Conservation Commission meeting. So I don't know if we want to continue this to
Another
Another-
a
date?
different date, since we have time to do this.
Got my number.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't see any point in
Ian, are you there?
prolonging things unnecessarily. My own view
Ian's
is
back
that
on.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm back.
Did you hear the last motion, Ian?
I didn't. I've been cut off for about 5 minutes now.
Well, Council, George recommended that we be more specific and make this a finding, that and you've got the,
Yeah, the motion was, you moved to make a finding that there is a reasonable alternative to the project as proposed.
Did you hear that, Ian?
No.
There was a motion that the commission make a finding that there is a reasonable alternative to the project as proposed.
Got you.
And then there was
Okay.
quite a bit of discussion about the word reasonable.
and then we voted
No doubt.
and said,
Okay, so it's up, so what's your vote, Ian?
My vote is the same as before.
Which is an aye?
Aye.
or-
Yes.
Okay,
so that's 4 to 2.
4 to 2.
And thank counsel for his advice.
Thank you. Yes. So we're trying to figure out,
When's a
Jim's
good
got to
time?
go, when is a good time? We've got, next scheduled meeting's Monday, Wednesday.
Wednesday.
I'll be back on island then.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe we should just
Can we
go for
start it
Wednesday
earlier
and
at
then-
like 3? And is that something where from 3 to
Well,
4?
and what do we want to do? We've got to give the staff some direction about what
Yeah,
kind of
I
audit
think we
to
should
prepare?
start working on a denial, frankly, because we have a reasonable alternative, so,
Make the
that's-
motion, let's vote it.
yep. So, what do you all
Well,
think?
I would think we could work on a denial.
Yeah, do you think we can work on it? Jen?
Well, if you guys feel that you have the grounds and the basis for it, and I'll take instructions that you guys feel fit, but you may have to have additional discussion about that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I
relates
think we-
specifically to.
Yeah, try to
I know
find some, yeah.
council-
This goes back to what I had said before. You do want to base it on the record, that cite the evidence in the record that supports that finding. And I would make a finding on that, we find that X, Y,
Z.
Z suggested on such and such a date is a reasonable alternative to the project for X, Y, Z reasons. And you want to be pretty specific on that.
Well, we still haven't really discussed the adverse impacts either.
Right, there's
Yeah.
more that we could potentially discuss that would go into whether or not people would accept or deny this project. This was just a portion of the discussion, I would say.
Yeah, whatever order we write has to be based upon
Yeah.
the information that we have, and the information that's available.
I think it'd be smart to vet all of it.
I'm in Boston Tuesday, but I can move mine so I can get back Tuesday by 4. Right now I have a 1 to 2:30, but I can switch that to morning.
Well, we have a regularly scheduled meeting next Wednesday at 4.
Okay.
Should we just go to there? and
We
then-
can do it as part of that. I mean,
As I said, I can only
She's
be at
gotta
that
leave.
meeting until 6.
our deadline is the following Wednesday. Is our 21 days since we closed the last hearing last week. So we have 21 days from there to issue whatever decision is going to be issued.
If we discussed everything first next week, I think within 2 hours between now and then we can come up with specifics. Don't you think? I hope so.
Have a good try.
So if we did it from 4 to 6 was the discussion on the rest of, would that work?
Well, we got other things to meet on, too.
I know of them.
Yeah, and I hate to cut all of that short by me not being able to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fine with meeting Tuesday night, Thursday night next week. I can meet this weekend. I don't know.
Yes, I will be severely jet lagged Tuesday, as it's a 6-hour time difference. So I would prefer, Thursday, Friday, if we're going to have a specific meeting for it, if that's all right with you guys.
Sure.
We'll
Well,
have
Thursday's the
site visits on
29th.
Tuesday, I think, right? 'Cause
Yeah, we do have
Monday's Tuesday.
we do have site visits on Tuesday.
So site visits are Tuesday next week.
Yeah.
I would suggest moving towards the regularly scheduled hearing, and we can do what we want, and we can always schedule for, well, Thursday, Friday.
But would that give us
Monday,
enough time
Tuesday, Wednesday.
to schedule for Thursday? With the 24, 48-hour notice?
Maybe we should just schedule Thursday now.
We can always unschedule, can't we? I'm just trying to make sure that you can.
Well, if you want, we can put it on the agenda for Wednesday, and I can also post it for Thursday. And then we could.
Why don't we do that?
Let's do
Is
this.
Yeah.
that fair to do?
I think that.
having me here?
It would be awesome. You could be here.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Thursday would be better for me than Wednesday.
Oh,
Okay.
well,
Okay,
So let's
well,
just
that
do it
works.
Thursday. Well, and I think it's easier for us to think of just this case all by itself.
I kind of agree. This takes up a lot of
Yeah.
effort.
So
It
are we
doesn't even-
directing the staff to begin to prepare an order, or we're not ready to do that yet?
Well, Jeff, do you think you can start on it?
Let's not play a game if we're going to deny it. I mean, let's just vote
Yeah,
to
yeah,
deny it.
let's just, yeah.
I'm prepared for whatever instructions you guys want to give me to do whatever you guys ask.
I think if our
It just-
finding is that there's a reasonable alternative, then I think that would lead me to believe that we should deny the project as proposed, because we found that there was a reasonable alternative, and at least in 2 or 3 sections, like 2.05B, that there are reasonable
I think that logic
alternatives.
follows. If you're finding that you are denying it. So
Yeah.
I would appreciate if we could actually,
Be
I'd
that.
rather not have the staff working on a denial before we vote on what to do, and I think he probably has work to do. So I'd appreciate it if,
Okay, well.
So have we
Well-
kind of made the determination that there is no way to condition this that turns it into a reasonable alternative? 'Cause
Not simply.
I don't think we can, I mean, it's doable, but I don't think we can engineer to that degree.
I think we should check
I
with town
think-
council too.
Yeah, I think Jess made that clear, that you can only,
You can only use the information that's provided.
yeah.
And none
And
of
we
us-
did kind of,
I can't stamp a plan with new engineered drawings, so that's,
right.
or none of you.
And
can
that
either.
doesn't preclude them from coming back with a new application.
Yeah, we could have a whole new notice and have some meetings.
I love these. I think we should do this
George, I think you
forever.
might have a suggestion too.
George?
Did you have a suggestion, or you just?
No, as I said, if you're only going to go on reasonable alternatives, then I would just make a record of what that is.
Right, right, and I
You know,
think,
mitigation is a different issue. That went more to what Andy was saying earlier, which is a separate issue. If you're saying that, no, there are no more reasonable alternatives to achieve the project purpose than what they proposed, but we ordered the following conditions to that would be different than an alternative. In other words, a condition on their project as proposed, a condition on their geotube saying you need more cubic feet of sand or whatever it may be, would be a condition on that project, as opposed to you saying, no, this particular project is not the best alternative.
Let me ask a question. on the waiver, the no adverse impact, no reasonable alternative, does that have to meet both of those requirements or just one or the other?
For waiver, it's required to meet both.
It has to meet both
No adverse,
independently.
and there,
Because then I think we could have equally well taken a vote on are there adverse impacts and come up with
well, and it's
I mean-
different
Well,
for
I think
each of the
effectively you
performance.
voted to issue a negative order.
Yeah,
And I
yes.
think that was the whole point of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
yeah.
Well, even with those things, I mean, at some point, the commission is still going to have
a
findings,
series
like
of
town
findings.
council said, that just because there's no, you can find that there are
Because
no
of these
reasonable
interests.
alternatives, and another finding say that commission finds that based upon evidence in the record from such that
From
these
the-
were demonstrated to
Yeah.
be alternatives. You need to kind of have the part A with part B.
Right. And we have to go through, so,
Yeah, it's the basis for your finding.
right,
And
so
that's in turn the basis for your
It's kind of like
But the-
citing your work.
the beach and the bluff as a sediment source, we can find, I mean, we have to go through each of those
Yeah, each of
interests.
those and look at it.
Wildlife interest, erosion control, ability, bank stability, habitat. I can write up some stuff for next Thursday. I mean, I think all of us can look through and
Yeah, just kind of start looking at the,
all the
Regs
performance
and-
standards, and
You know, it's kind of required of you to do. So
you can help us if we're saying something stupid.
that's what I'm here to do.
Okay.
But I'm happy to take any instructions or guidance or anything you guys want. You just have to tell me what to do. Not a free thinker.
I
Well-
think we're leaning toward a negative.
If that's
Yeah,
the
I think
case,
we're
then you guys
looking
need to
toward a
let me know that.
denial.
Yes, well, do we need a vote to that?
I would appreciate it if you're going to issue out instructions that it at least be from the majority of the board.
Okay. so-
Okay, Ian, are you still there?
Again, I'm not a free thinker.
Yeah.
Yes, I still am.
Okay.
Okay, so do we need to do a motion on this, or do we just do a sense of the commission? Do we need a motion to have Jeff write up a
I would
denial?
say to start preparing
To start
a negative
preparing a
order.
negative order.
So
That's how I would
moved.
phrase that.
Okay, I have a motion, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, this motion was to have Jeff start preparing a,
This isn't by any means an issuance.
It's
No,
not,
it's
no,
just
it's
to
just
prepare.
to start
It's
preparing.
instructions for me.
Yeah. And negative,
prepare a negative order.
yeah. And we have a motion and a second.
Okay, Ian,
Aye.
Jen,
Aye.
Sarah,
Aye.
Ernie, aye, Andy.
I'm going to say nay.
Okay, Mike.
Nay.
Okay, that motion carries
I will start preparing.
Okay.
4-2.
Yeah, 4-2. You guys are very nice naysayers.
Yeah.
Do we move to continue to,
Yeah, I guess we'll just close the hearing.
no,
No,
the hearing's
no,
closed.
no,
This
well,
is the
then,
debate.
yeah,
We're not
just
closing
close.
anything.
We need to continue
To
to
adjourn the meeting.
To a
To a
date.
date specific.
Yeah.
1 second. We had one more thing on the agenda, please.
Oh, that's
Okay.
right. Oh, gosh, yeah, we got a couple of things on the agenda.
And are you, Ernie, are you sending it Thursday? Or do you have a date?
I think
I think we're putting Thursday on,
we're putting Thursday on, but we'll probably have some discussion on Wednesday if we have time as well. And if you're not here, we can get you to review it.
Yeah, well, so what are you doing, both days, or just?
I think
Well,
we're doing
we-
Thursday.
I think we're going to end up doing Thursday for sure, but if we have a really short agenda on Wednesday, we could. But it's not likely we'll get much done on Wednesday because Jen's got to leave early. So
Yeah. I mean, I would if you want council present, I would recommend you put it
just do it on Thursday.
Yeah.
Thursday.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's
let's
just do it
I
on
think we
Thursday
should
then.
continue that
Okay.
Till Thursday.
till
Yeah.
Thursday. Hey, Jeff, do you have a form without me for this?
Is this a draft denial order of conditions?
No, it's not.
What is it?
Well, Jeff's going
Yeah.
to start drafting it. Yeah, Jeff will start drafting a denial. Yes.
Yeah.
So just call it a denial.
A draft.
A draft. Yeah.
Denial.
Yeah. I mean, it's just something that we'll have to flush out. He's just going to start it. It's going to be pretty.
And we
simple.
haven't voted on it yet, so,
Right, I just want the nomenclature.
Yes.
Yes, there's a little more
Yeah, it's like-
tweakability.
yeah. No, I'm supposed to be somewhere in about 10 minutes too, but.
All right, sorry. I do have a new draft for you with some new findings for this one. We don't have to issue this one tonight. The waiver's on the back.
Okay.
What time on Thursday is this being continued to?
I would say
4
4.
o'clock.
Thank you.
Here, probably, here preferably.
It's almost set. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. See ya.
Okay, we'll see you next week.
So this is some revised findings to the draft that we had before for the in-town bike path. Again, we don't
I
have to
thought we
issue.
did this 3 and 3.
Oh, we already lost Jen.
Well, we did do 3 and 3, which is,
Isn't that a denial?
no, it's a tie.
Well, I know it's a tie, but I thought.
Well, if we would have made a
Tie
motion to
goes
issue a
down.
denial and it was 3 to 3, that's still a tie.
Oh, okay. I thought tie meant that it wasn't approved. I thought we'd had a tie before. And
No.
Well, now we're down to 5 members.
yeah.
So again, we don't have to issue it this evening. We can still, if you guys want to go through it or make suggestions, I added a couple additional findings to it.
I'm still here, guys.
Yeah, we good for you. Hope you're having a nice drink. We're looking right now at 4 Goose Pond Lane, and I think we should probably continue this to next week if we can, so we can read this, but especially since you don't have it in front of you, but,
Yeah, and Jen's not.
Yeah.
and Jen's not here. It's a permit
Well,
of, go ahead.
I guess if we could, since it's
It's
just,
pointless.
Hmm?
It's on our agenda, it's here, people
Okay,
choose
well,
to
let's
be
vote
be at the
then.
meeting or
No.
not be at the
I don't
meeting.
think this is a controversial.
Well, so be here if you want to be here.
so the findings that we added was finding number 2 that I put, the commission finds that given the current level of disturbance, the man-made nature of the berm, the man-made separation of the pond and salt marsh, the existing culverts, and the presence of invasive species, that the project as proposed will not have an adverse import to the resource area with the measures taken and the proposed mitigation for the project.
I would feel much better if they were going to put the, improve the drainage.
I don't agree with both 2 and 3. I just don't agree with it. I won't vote for it.
Well, we can edit, we can discuss those things.
Yep,
That's what we're here to do.
yep, so,
I mean, that's,
well, the number 3, the commission finds there are no reasonable alternatives to the project as proposed for the use intended. I can,
The commission now finds reasonable alternatives to anything at all.
there's a lot of things that I vote yes on almost everything. I'm 95% yes rate.
Well, they need to, the sheet piles are concerned, right? Or is it the road
That
bed?
it's the permeability of the
The
surface.
permeability,
I mean, they both are, but the bigger issue is whether it's going to absorb rain instead of sheet off contaminants.
Yeah, well, I mean, the bulkhead concept was needed to gain the width of the path to meet the state ridiculously wide bike paths.
Right, that's why they're
So
having to pad the
that's
sheet.
the trend. So
Yeah.
personally,
I mean,
you
at
know,
least it's kind of-
chemically treated wood as opposed to steel, I think I'd pick the steel
Yeah.
personally.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's.
So from the
for
sheet
sure.
pile point of view,
Sure. No, I'm not
Aesthetics.
as upset about
Yeah.
that. I'm more worried about pouring
The
asphalt
permeability.
and then having rain hit it.
yeah.
And it extracts chemicals in the asphalt and puts it straight into the scallop area. So I just don't like pouring asphalt.
No, I
there.
understand. There's so much of
It's
all
not
that-
a-
all those roads down there dump into the bay anyway.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
kind of
there's
a,
so much asphalt.
it's a relatively, it's a micro amount compared to
Yeah.
the amount we pump let go in there. But I know what you're
Exactly.
saying.
Yeah.
Back
But
to the word reasonable.
Yeah, I think this has, I mean, I would have felt better if they also would have looked at how permeable that material is in the first place. I know that was a concern that got expressed, but they never did any perk tests or anything. I
No,
think they
no.
just-
Well, my only, and I can totally see if you guys vote for this in the positive, my only concern is just because it's really messed up area, doesn't mean we should add insult to injury. To me, that makes it a bigger concern.
Sure.
If it was, though, I guess you could say if it was pristine, then you wouldn't want to add one drop. But
Yeah.
just because we've really mistreated this area
Yeah.
for a long time, doesn't mean
Right.
we should keep doing that.
I guess, not
But
to
if
throw.
you, go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead, please.
But if everyone's relatively fine with it, it's, I mean,
I'm relatively fine. with
I'm
it.
one person.
I mean,
Move to issue it, Mr. Chairman.
I could see more pleasantries, but
Yeah, I would change, if you're going to move to issue, this order permits the installation of sheet
Oh,
piles.
sorry.
Okay, so move to issue as amended.
I'll move to issue it as prepared.
second.
Okay. Ian, we have a motion to issue.
Can you tell them what it is?
What are the amendments?
I'm sorry, this is,
Sorry, I didn't fully understand the amendment. And could we also I've got terrible feedback right now. I don't know why.
Any better?
Hello?
Is that
still
better?
No,
Get you, pull that back maybe?
I'm getting something screeching. Is that better? Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So what were, the
Do you
motion,
have anything about the two split rails as opposed to the 3 split rail fence?
Yeah, we can put in a condition number 22 that the split rail fence be 2 split rails.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Okay.
did you need, Ian, for us to read through anything, or do you understand that this is for 4 Coos Pond Lane?
I think so, unless it's changed significantly from
Yeah,
last week.
nothing's really changed on the order.
Yeah.
No, it's
The
some new
project
findings,
is the same, yeah, we just changed the
new
findings.
findings and then that condition.
And Bam, you're sitting on this one,
Okay.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so we got a motion right now to move as, with the word, addition of the word of,
And the condition 22.
and the condition 22.
Is that correct, Mike?
Sure.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Ian?
Aye.
Sarah?
Nay?
Ernie? Aye. Andy?
Aye.
Bam.
Aye.
Mike?
Aye.
Okay,
Okay, that motion carries with Commissioner Otai opposed.
Perfect. I'll make those corrections and
okay.
put it around for everyone to sign, and
What you're saying.
we'll be good.
It's, I can see both ways.
Yeah.
All right, so
Okay,
let's,
thank you.
Now people can bike along.
Okay, so do we want to do a, you had some.
And I'm going to come to Mike's house and actually pour asphalt right in his backyard. Huh?
Basketball court.
Frank Spriggs with me?
that's my landlord.
Huh? Oh. Frank likes me.
Oh, we
He'll-
don't want to do anything to Frank.
Yeah.
Mike, no, I don't know, but Frank, he's one of, yeah.
All right, well, let's
Okay.
keep moving here.
Keep it
moving.
moving. Yes, I'm
You
supposed
wanna
to be
do
somewhere in
approval
2
of
minutes. I would, I mean, I found a
You've
ton
got
of
issues,
typos.
So, no, we
so-
want to skip that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I don't
Jeff, do you have anything,
Nope.
any commissioners have anything burning they want to bring up?
No meeting, nothing happened.
Okay,
I have seen stuff being
so
built
I
all
think
over.
we're ready to have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved.
Okay,
Everyone could please
Second.
review those minutes for next Wednesday.
Yep.
and we'll just do that by unanimous consent unless somebody objects to adjourn.
You biking or walking?
Well,
Thank you,
Ian.
Thanks,
We'll see you next week.
Thanks,
Have a
Ian.
great time.
Yeah, you come
Say hi
back
to
all
Laura. She's
tanned
there.
and,
Lucky duck.
yeah,
Enjoy
full of
missing the guy.
luau's and whatever everything's
I'll
over
try
there.
not to enjoy myself too much.
Okay. We'll see you when you get back. Take care of that back.
All right.
Tweak that border.
Well, thanks everybody for.
Yeah, thank you.